It does take a lot of strength and certainly courage to show up as your boundaried self. It takes strength and courage to no longer allow the gaslighting to be effective on you, because we can't stop people from gaslighting. We can't stop people from guilt tripping, but we can certainly proceed with the no after they issue some guilt tripping. We certainly could say, I recognize what you're doing. You're trying to manipulate me, and I'm not going to say that didn't happen, or I'm not going to keep this thing a secret, or I'm not going to pretend that, things are hunky dory in front of everyone when we actually have a problem. You can still decide to do that. It's not about changing everyone else and how they show up with you. It's about changing you and how you show up with them.
Oh, God, I like that. I'm just going to keep going through that. How do you stay strong in those moments? So, because you say in your book about how a lot of people, when you're trying to make these changes in your family dynamic, because it's been so long, right, since childhood, from everything that you've brought from your childhood into adulthood, how do you start changing those dynamics when they're trying to, let's say, pretend that it didn't happen? You talk about denial a lot. Mm-hmm. And in those moments of denial and gaslighting, it's so hard to be so strong in your own conviction when you maybe have 5 other people in your family, your siblings and your parents, all telling you that, no, it wasn't like that, or no, it didn't happen like that, and it's all you.
Do we need to go to the people who are causing the harm for validation of their harm? They may not be in that space to affirm what you're going through. They may not be able to affirm your experience, because now you're asking them to do the work of dealing with themselves. They may not be in that healing space. You're in that healing space. And so when the support is no longer in your family, or not, with extended family members, you have to seek support outside of that system. I will, recognize that in some families, we don't think there's any support because we haven't been vocal about the issue. But there may be a cousin, there may be an aunt, there may be someone in there who identifies with what you're saying. And if not, there's friends, there's, people in your community, there are online communities, there are tons of other people who may know what you're going through that you can identify with. It may not be within the system that caused the issue.
What about the deep-rooted betrayal that a lot of people feel about going against their family? You have a quote that you say, unintentional harm is still harm. But I think because we say, well, it's blood, we almost often dismiss the harm that's been done to us.
Yeah, I've had years of work with children who were in child protective services. They were removed from their home for physical abuse, sexual abuse, and to minimize a person's harm. And it was interesting in those situations, kids wanted to be with their families no matter what happened. It's like, I want to go back home. So even if it was a case where it was not safe for them, they wanted to forgive because it was family, even if it wasn't the healthiest thing for them. So I know that when we get to the place of, I no longer want to be in this relationship, or I need to take space from this relationship, typically something pretty serious or relentless has happened in the relationship, and we have to allow people the space to have some distance without us implying that you should talk to your family no matter what. Blood is thicker than water. Don't you feel guilty? It's your mom. My mother is not your mother, so I can't say, what happened in your house. All we know is how a person presents. And your mother could present very well to other people, or your father can present well, or your siblings. We don't know what's happening in other folks' relationships. So it's very hard to say this is what should happen in families. All families look different.
But what about that notion? The mother thing's really strong, girl, because so many people say that, but you've only got one mother. What are you going to do? Not talk to her? And so that guilt trip, that idea that, oh my God, I should be this way, or it means that I'm less of a child, a person, or less of a daughter if I decide to not speak to my mother. Like, that's so hard. And so that really does trap us into a relationship where we're being mistreated. And I think you even said, like, just because it's your family doesn't mean that you should accept mistreatment.
Well, think about this. Think about a girlfriend that you've had that just turned out to be not a great person. Picture her as a mom doing those same things to her child. I think sometimes when we're thinking about the mother child relationship, we're not thinking about the behavior of the actual mother. We're thinking about this is a parent, and no matter what, we're giving it a lot of role and not a lot of relationship. The relationship part is really important. I've known some women, it's like, oh my gosh, girl, I can't believe you like that. I can't imagine how they might be to a child. We don't know, and so it's very hard for me to meet a woman who says, or a man who says, I don't have a relationship with my parent. I don't want to challenge that because I don't know what that situation is. I have a lot of compassion for it because that's a hard place to get to, because we are programmed to attach to our parents even when they've done many things. And so once a person gets to that place, when you don't understand, it's best to listen. It's best to perhaps ask questions if it's appropriate. But it's certainly not okay to guilt trip them or shame them in any way because you don't know the full story.
So many of us, Nedra, have been bred to have unconditional loyalty. So in these moments where maybe you can even identify, yes, my mother is mistreating me, that we just then accept, well, that's who they are. And that means I should just stay in this abusive, mistreated relationship.
I am loyal to love. I'm not loyal to abuse. I'm not loyal to abandonment. I'm not loyal to persecution. And I think we mix up what love is, because people will abuse you and say, I love you, now go to bed, after after they've done a ton of things, or not taking good care of you, or maybe hurt you in some way. They will still say, I love you. And so that's very confusing, to have love infused with abuse and neglect, even from a sibling bullying you, to have I love you infused with bullying. And sometimes we get it twisted in our mind, like, well, maybe they do. They're still here, and maybe their idea of love is also twisted. But can we have love where there is pain? I'm not talking about humans being humans where they make a mistake every once in a while, they get it wrong. I'm talking about sometimes intentional pain. Is that loving? And so loyalty is important sometimes, but we have to question what we're being loyal to. Are we being loyal to lies? Are we being loyal to keeping secrets that are actually hurtful for us? Are we being loyal to, abusive situations? Sometimes we are. With mothers or fathers who have tendencies of being overbearing, of, maybe sometimes being mean, I do wonder, within us, what do we do to change those situations? I was talking to a woman who said her mother calls her every day, and if she doesn't call her mother back, she's like, why didn't you call me? You were leaving work. Why didn't you answer the phone? And she's like, I feel a lot of pressure. Like, if we don't want to talk to someone as an adult, you have the opportunity to perhaps not talk to that person as much as they would like. And it's really hard when someone is demanding it. You call me when you get here, call me when you get back, answer the phone when I call. And I said, it sounds like you and your mom have different boundaries. Her expectation is that she talks to you all the time. Your expectation is that she doesn't. I'm talking to you. So who am I talking to about enforcing expectations? You. I can't go to her. She's not here. I can't go to her and say, girl, stop calling her. But I can look at you and say, why do you answer? Have you ever said anything to her about that? What have you tried to do? Because it's one thing to say, oh, this person, I can't believe they're doing all this stuff to me. And it's another thing to go along with all the stuff they're doing.
I just need to let that last line sink in. That was so good. So how do you then actually like separate those two? Because again, like there's so much belief that has been embedded in us as growing up that how do we know what we're just going along with versus what we should be going along with?
What feels good and what doesn't? Going back to those feelings and saying, because there are some, parents, you love to talk to them multiple times a day. Don't change that. It's in situations where people don't that it's problematic. So how do you say this doesn't work for me as you would in any other relationship? How do you say, for the holidays, I don't want to come to your house, or, I'll be spending the holidays, with my friends, or whatever those things are. How do you start to say that? Because people can demand or they can request whatever they want to. They have your phone number, they can call you, they can text you, they can do all of these things. How do you respond to that? I think of social media, and people will say like, how do you, make people be nice to you? I don't. I get crazy DMs. How do I not respond to them is the bigger question, because I don't respond, and I block them because this is not a type of behavior that I tolerate.
And you've decided that beforehand, so it's easier for you to show up and draw that boundary.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, as you were talking, I'm always trying to think about what is the reality of humans. And so there's these people that are listening to everything you're saying that is so beautiful and it's so concrete. But what is the thing that gets in our way? Why do we still have problems with our family dynamics, with how we've been treated as children, and how we bring that into our adulthood? And I was just thinking about those moments where maybe we're trying to set boundaries with our parents or trying to set boundaries with our families because we really want to build confidence. We want to build, resilience in ourselves. And so we're practicing these things. Okay, so step number one, I need to start setting boundaries with my family. The thing that I think holds a lot of people up, especially when it comes to families, parents, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but in you saying, I'm not going to go to a Christmas dinner, right? Mm-hmm. Let's say that's a beautiful way to go. I've assessed my mental health, what I need, and what is going to be detrimental to my mental health. And maybe you've decided, you know what, if I go to this dinner, then it's not going to be good for my mental health. But then the realities of life and humanity come flooding in, where maybe it's like, but what if they die and you never get another Christmas with them? So I'm going dramatic, but this is actually how I think. And I think that this is very true to so many people, where it's like, but what if I disappoint my dad and I don't, and I marry this person and he passes away and my marriage doesn't work, and now I've disappointed my dad and he was right in a way, right? Like we do project fears into our decisions that we make. And I think that those fears often dictate maybe the poor boundaries that we believe that we either shouldn't have, or the direction that we go in our life doesn't actually serve us.
That is a huge reason we stay in relationships, because of that what if. What if they get sick? What if I'm not around when this happens? There is this fear that something tragic will happen and we'll miss it because of these boundaries we place, because of these things we put in action in the relationship. And, I think when you get to a point of maybe severing ties with someone, or placing a boundary, or creating some distance, or even just making some changes in the relationship, you do it when you're ready for it. And if those are your thoughts, if you're still thinking about what if, that could be a sign you're not ready. And that's okay. There's no pressure to change at any point. As a therapist, I've seen people struggle, in some family relationships forever because they don't want to leave them. And that's so much of what this book is about. It's really about, how do you change your role in the relationship when you're not ready to leave? Because every relationship isn't to be discarded. If I have issues in my relationship with my mother, I call and I talk to her about those issues. I have not thought, you know what, I need to stop talking to her. It's like, hey, okay, new boundary, girl. Like, here's the thing. So when you came to visit, this is the thing. It's not always, you know what, we need to end this relationship. She may get upset sometimes, but I get upset when she does certain things. Isn't that a part of a relationship? I try to make relationships seem like a space where people will annoy you. They won't always get things right. And it doesn't mean that you don't love them. It just means you're in a relationship. You will argue with people. You will have disagreements. That's a part of being in a relationship. If you're expecting perfection always in a family relationship, in a romantic relationship, it's not going to be a very healthy relationship. You will have to say something to people because you're growing and changing, and so are they. And I think one of the things that happens when you become an adult is there is still that age difference there in our relationship with some family members, but hopefully there starts to be the respect of adulthood, that you have the opportunity to create the life you wanted, just like your parents did, just like your siblings are doing, just like everybody else is doing. You get to do that too.
How do you then help if that dynamic hasn't changed, right? Because thinking about identity and everything that you just said, often when you're a child, especially being the youngest, so I'm the youngest child, I've my entire life thought of myself as the youngest child. And so I'm talked to by my parents as the youngest child, and then my siblings will talk to me like the youngest child. And then recently they hit me up over text, and we were having this big family text, and it was this big decision that we were making over it's a family issue. And I'd been the youngest child, kind of just stepped back. And everyone was like, Lisa, you need to speak up. And I was like, oh my God, it hadn't even dawned on me that the dynamics had changed and that the identity was that, or the thing that they had seen me as now is the person that helps makes decisions. But I had had the identity of being the youngest child that I put myself in that position. How often do you see that dynamic happen? And then how do you help people either pivot their identity to be the adult instead of staying as that child? And then how to help the family see that you've changed?
Some of the things that we learned in childhood, it still works for us, right? Like I'm the youngest child, right? And I remember my sibling and I have a huge age gap. So I remember like with my sibling and my older cousins being like, don't tell me what to do. So I always wanted like this autonomy. And I'm still very much like that. And, you know, it's not necessarily problematic. And I find that I gravitate towards other people who have that same sort of younger sibling energy. Like it's just something that, you know, I'm used to, and I like that sort of personality. But I will also say with that, you have to figure out when you are being the youngest or the oldest in a situation that doesn't require it. You know, if you're the oldest child and you're used to like, you know, telling all these little people what to do, you may not need to do that at work. Your friends might not like that very much. If you're the youngest and you're like, I don't care what everybody else says, it's like, no, speak up. You know, so there are times where that doesn't work for us anymore. And we have to recognize it, especially when you get into a relationship and it's like, this person expects me to do everything for them because they're the youngest and they're used to being catered to. It's like, this isn't, you got to change your role now. So we have to think about like what happened to us and how it impacts our relationships. How are we showing up? Not all things are going to be problematic, but some things are. I'm with you. Like sometimes you know, especially in a group dynamic, I'm very quiet. I'm like, everybody else make a decision and I'll go with it, or I'll say no. I'm like, doesn't work for me, but I won't get in on the decision making because it's like, you pull together. And I know that like with you, sometimes that could be problematic because I'm not making a decision, but I'm like, I really kind of don't care. I'm going to do it or not.
So how do you then identify when it's useful and when it's not useful?
What is the pushback? What are other people saying about it? You have to be open to that feedback from other people. Like your siblings said, we need you to make a decision. And so you have to step out of that and say, this is not being useful. Now, other situations, it might be okay, but in this situation, it's not useful for me to not have a perspective.
Yeah, I love that. You said earlier about, is it time to cut ties? So with everything we're talking about, how do you advise someone with those steps? So they've identified that they've got a problem. they've got a problem as an adult, they've identified that it's from some form of dysfunction as a child. You've laid out beautifully like all the different variations, you go really deep in your book. And now once you've identified it, what are the steps you advise someone to take? Because I assume you don't jump straight to, well, come out your life, done. But at some point, that decision is a very wise option. And I want people to know, which you write in your book beautifully, it is an option. And I don't think a lot of us see walking away from our family as an option. But if that's not the go-to immediately, what are the steps? And then how would you advise someone to make that decision for the sake of their mental health?
Well, walking away is an option when there is abuse in the situation currently. You know, there are adults who are still being abused by the parent who abused them. I mean, physically. I've heard of some people say, my mom hit me.
As an adult?
As an adult. Wow. Yeah, or, you know, my dad screams at me, or he has, and you know, I think in those situations, you can try to talk to the person, you can try to set boundaries, and if you see that those things aren't helping, you have the option to not be in that relationship when it is physically unsafe, when it is mentally unsafe for you. I think about sexual abuse or incest in families. It is unsafe for you to, you know, maybe have dinner with the person who sexually abused you. Maybe that is psychologically damaging. So each situation is different. And it is up to the person to decide, is this a situation that is continuing to cause me harm? Now, the process to getting there is trying to do something to repair those relationships. And that starts with having some conversations around the history of the relationship and what is happening presently. So if you are now an adult and your parent is, you know, perhaps still an alcoholic, how have you talked to them about what you expect from them now?
One of the biggest fallacies is that relationships shouldn't be work. Say what? We put time, effort, and hard work into growing our careers or our business, but love should just happen? After 20 years of being married, all starts with being willing to ask and answer hard questions. I have a free downloadable PDF for you for a happy, successful, lasting love. Click the link below for free access to the most important questions you must ask your partner PDF. Do you start with when you were a child, or do you just start with the now?
That's interesting. I think most of us want to start with the childhood because we want this person to really feel it. I think when people are still unwell, I don't know if they will give you that validation you're looking for from the childhood stuff because they're not in recovery yet. A lot of the work in that relationship is going to be present focused. What can we do presently? Hey, if you're drinking, I don't want you to come to this thing. Or when you're driving, I will call it whatever the, you know, I'll take your keys, or, you know, whatever those things are. You can do that presently, but you certainly can have that conversation of childhood just to clear the space. You know, sometimes you just want to have that conversation to get things out, but the expectation that they'll actually say, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I didn't even know that. You know, sometimes we want that. We want people to free us because they're still in the mold of it. But when people are unwell presently, I'm not sure that they can hear you in the way that you need to be heard. And so when you get into, this is the trauma you caused me, would it be more harmful for them to gaslight you? Would it be more harmful for them to deny it? Would it be more harmful for them to say that it didn't happen this way? This was actually, you know, what happened? Possibly. But if you feel like you can withstand that, then have the conversation. But just know that, you know, we don't know how the conversation will go. Like some people will say like, you know, can I tell my parents this? You absolutely can. What is your expectation for this? Is the expectation that they'll stop, you know, this behavior immediately that they've been doing for 25 years? Is the expectation that they'll apologize? What is your expectation? Because have the conversation and then think about how you want to continue to show up in that relationship. That's the important piece. Whether you talk about the past or the present, it is about you and how you want to be in that relationship. It's not about changing them, because they're creating the life they want to have. Even if the life is unhealthy, even if the life is harmful to other people, they are making a choice, and you are making a choice to be well. And a part of that is saying, you know, when you're calling me and you're talking about, you know, everybody in the family, I don't want to hear those sort of things about my cousins. I don't want to hear those sort of things about my siblings. So I will either remain silent or I will redirect the conversation.
God, that's so beautiful. So as you start to write, though, your expectations, are the expectations, like I assume that may be setting yourself up for disaster, because if they don't meet those expectations, now you may spiral even more. So do you, when you're saying to someone, okay, write down the expectations, is it just the exercise and then to say, and now don't expect any of that? That like, what does that expectation list look like? And how do we use it as that first step into the conversation? Because there's that massive gap, right, between knowing it and then actually doing it. It's like sometimes you may be worse off than if you hadn't said anything at all.
Oh, I love that. That's the part. I've had people write letters, these long, thought out letters to their parents about everything that happened, and they're so sad, and they send the parent the letter and the parent doesn't respond. Or they send the parent the letter and the parent calls and they start, I can't believe you. So it's cathartic for us to get it out, right? And that's to anybody. You know, letter writing is a great way to get your feelings out. It's a journaling process. However, will this other person free you? I think our freedom is within. I know what happened. I know how it feels. I can share this with this person if I choose to, but they cannot free me from my experience, because that is for me to do.
And is that then part of it? Maybe even writing down, and so that is why I'm doing it, so that I'm freeing myself.
Yes.
And that expectation you can guarantee if you then say it, because that's in your control.
Absolutely. But if the expectation is you have to agree with everything in this letter for me to feel more free, you have to now apologize, you have to now go and make amends to 8 people, and you know, it's like now you're stepping over into how they have to change. And we can't do that with people. And I think it makes sense that we want that. Like it's not, you know, abnormal to want that from people. I just think it's harmful to ourselves to expect it from people, because people are still struggling with their stuff. When we start to heal, when we start to go to therapy, when we read self-help books, it doesn't mean that everybody else in your life is doing that same thing. They are still in the sunken place. And you're trying to say, you know, I have all of this insight, think like me now. And it's like, I've not acknowledged anything. I'm still out here, you know, blaming everything on everyone else. I'm still out here mad at, you know, your dad. I still don't like my own brother. You know, like they still have all those issues. So them showing up for you and your experience, you know, it's possible that they're not capable of that.
It's probably likely, right?
Yeah.
And so as you start to then talk to your family, maybe see that they're not capable, in you then deciding either to accept them for who they are, because that's what you say in your book, right? You cannot change people. Changing yourself is enough, I believe, is your quote. So beautiful. So in the attempt that maybe you tried to change them, you see that it doesn't work. Okay, now you're trying to change yourself. You start to feel really good about the changes that you're making. You then enter back into your family as this person who's changed, and then they throw comments like, well, you've changed. You're not the same person you used to be. And for someone who may not already be so strong in their own conviction of who they are, it's very hard to not revert back to that person that you were in that relationship. And so there becomes this like silent push and pull about the word change, and to you perceive this as joyful, proud, and to them it's seen as a detriment. You're the one ruining the family. Are those the moments where you decide, okay, is this healthy for me to be in? Should I step away?
We have to believe in who we're becoming. I once had a family member tell me I was funny acting. And I said, you know what? I thought about it. I was a little offended at first, and I thought about it for a while. I said, this person is right, because I'm not like them. All they're doing is noticing differences between us. If I won't, bend myself to your needs, that is a little change. If I won't allow, any sort of person to visit my home, that is a little change. So in some ways, it's a gift that you notice that. So maybe you will start to ask me before you do certain things, or maybe you will stop assuming certain things because now I am funny acting. So it's a gift. Please consider me.
I love that so much. I've actually started using, because you're so freaking great with giving people words and phrases when they come into these situations. And one thing I've been trying recently is when someone's like, oh my God, you changed. I'm like, thanks so much. I've worked really hard at it.
Yeah.
And now it's like, what are they going to say? If they meant it as an insult, they either have to stop you and go, well, actually, I didn't mean that. And then that kind of opens the door to you go, so what did you mean then? And then, because like passive aggressiveness, you see so much, especially in relationships where people can't seem to improve that dynamic, and so the passive aggressiveness comes in, and now it seems like it just makes things worse instead of actually making things better. And I definitely see that comment as being somewhat passive aggressive.
Absolutely. I think it's intended to make a person feel bad, but again, believing in who you're becoming, it doesn't even matter. It's like, you know what? I don't want to be a person who can be easily taken advantage of. So if me saying no to you is like, oh, I can't take advantage of her, I'm okay with that, because I don't want to be that anymore. So thank you for noticing. I have changed. There is something different about me. My no's are stronger. They are like consistent. Yeah, I think sometimes with family, there will be things that are said. There will be things that are, maybe pushed back on. And it's not necessarily that they're evil or they're mean, but we all want our needs met. If I go to a store and they close at 6:00 and I'm there at 5:59, I'm like, come on, one more minute. I want my need met. I get it. So it's not like they're doing anything that none of us have done before. They're just doing it against you, and they're doing it perhaps in a harmful way. You can have the conversation. You can certainly figure out how you want to perceive in the relationship. But what they're doing is, I would say, it's part of the human experience.
How do you move on from that then? Because you say in the book, which I'd never thought about it before, the quote of forgive and forget. You say that the body never forgets. The mind might, but the body won't. How do you start to actually let go of that? So it's not even forgetting. I think of it as like letting go, deliberately saying this no longer serves me.
Our body physically has a response to things that feel good to us and things that don't, whether that's anxiety, where, our stomach starts to churn and it's like, oh my gosh, I got to go to the bathroom. I need to eat something. I don't know what's happening. Right? Or it's sweating. It is, our inability to sleep. There are so many people who, before they engage with family, is like, I couldn't sleep. I didn't eat for a few days. And it's like, you're going to visit your mom. What is your nervous system telling you about visiting your mother? And when we really think about that, and don't ignore it, like, what is your body telling you about this relationship? Sometimes we feel uncomfortable in front of people. I've heard people say, I feel so uncomfortable in front of this person and I don't know why. Sometimes our memories don't start until we're 5 years old. I don't know what happened before that time. You have enough, sometimes you'll have like one or two and it's like, well, that wasn't okay. But what happened before then? Your body is remembering even if your brain can't. Even if that memory isn't coming back. I mean, it could be something small. When you're a little kid, it could be somebody yelling at you a certain way or pinching you or I don't know. But listen to your body.
And how do you identify if you're listening to your body and you start to make the connections, but you start to remember things where you were told it wasn't a big deal at the time? How do you start to know, like, actually that was a big deal? Or like, how do you start to identify what was a big deal when you've been told your whole life that that one moment or that occasion wasn't?
Or that moment was your fault.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because, I grew up in a culture when you were spanked, it was because you did something. Even if the spanking was severe, even if it was embarrassing, it was you did something. And it's like, well, I don't know if it was appropriate. And you could grow up believing like, oh no, I deserve that. But it's like, I remember going to school with a kid who was spanked in front of the class. That was his punishment. His mother would come to the school and whoop him in front of the class. And I'm like, I don't think that's your fault. That's like, and it didn't curb his behavior. He would continue to have behavior issues, but to some extent, it's like all of us witnessed that. The teachers, the students, and we were like, you better be good because your mom will come up here. But it wasn't okay. At that time, we thought it was. It was like he was misbehaving. That is the punishment for that. It's like, that's not okay.
And is it just then reassessing? Okay, it may have felt okay at the time, but do I still believe that now?
Yeah, it's reassessing that at the time, we use the tools we have. So if the tool is to accept, how dare you fight back against the people who are raising you? You wouldn't have food. You wouldn't have shelter. So, a lot of the going along with is also survival. But now that you're out of the survival of living in these situations, how do you start to reclaim the parts of the truth? How do you start to be honest with yourself about what happened and not normalize toxic behaviors or dysfunction? How do you start to say, my stepmother didn't treat me well. My dad, he, whatever those things are, how do you start to acknowledge that this was not okay? It's what happened, but what happened doesn't have to like be reconciled in your mind as like this pretty picture. And it doesn't mean you have to end the relationship. Sometimes we're afraid to talk about adult family relationships and what happened in the past because we feel like if we bring up the past, we have to end the relationship. And it's not about that. Sometimes it's just recognizing this is why I'm standoffish with this person.
What's the difference in between standoffish, ignoring someone, or just distancing yourself from someone?
I just had this conversation yesterday. Distancing I see as a protection. I see it as an intentional protection. So there is this idea that people have to talk to you all the time. It's not true. It's not true. In families, you can call someone and they can't answer their phone. I have found that when I set a very clear boundary with someone, like, hey, I'm busy at work or something, and they call me 4 times when I'm at work, I've had people tell other people, she's ignoring me. I clearly said, I'm at work. Like, there is no ignoring happening. Now what's happening is some distance because I'm at work and I can't respond. So is it always ignoring, or is it my interpretation of being ignored because you won't respond? So I think when a person is clear, it's not ghosting. When a person is clear, it's not ignoring. Now, if you choose to listen to that, that's up to you, but they're not ignoring you. They've been very clear. Sometimes people will say things like, I need a minute. If you're still pressuring them to talk, they are still needing their minute. Nothing has changed. You just want to talk to them. You want that communication. In families, Sometimes there will be a huge event, and afterwards there will be an estrangement, right? Like this, you think of, sometimes financial issues when a person dies, they don't have a will, and then, they have these big old family disputes. Everybody's aware of why they're mad, and some people will say, oh, they ghosted me. Well, they ghosted you because you were supposed to do this thing and you did this other thing. Like, it's a ghosting, but it's also a reason behind it. And that has to be recognized, that perhaps for that situation, they don't want to talk to you anymore. People don't have to be in relationship with you after you've offended them. In families, I do think there is this culture of no matter what I do to you, you have to continue to talk to me and you need to forget about it. That's just the way we roll. So if I do something to you and you don't want to talk to me after that, you're ghosting me. But you did something. If this were any other relationship, I would be allowed to leave. But because it's family, I'm expected to stay and take some more. This isn't a boxing match. We don't have to go more rounds. It's like, that was enough for me.
Dude, that hit me so hard. Like the fact that if it was if it was a relationship and they were abusing you, emotionally abusing you or anything, everybody, including your family, what are you doing? You've got to leave. They're toxic. They're so bad for you. But the second you would say, my family's doing this to me, it's like, but it's your family. You've only got one. That's so true.
It's wild the way that we, I posted something online about financial abuse within families. And I was talking about, in some situations, I have seen adults where their parents have taken, when they were kids, they took their financial information and started lines of credit or open bills, and they never paid them off. And so when these, people became adults and they're ready to go to college or they're ready to get their own place, they're walking into life with debt from this parent, which is a crime. It's a crime to use your child's credit for other things. And those people, I don't know anyone who had any legal ramifications for their family because it was family.
Well, so actually, in fact, this is super interesting because also cultures, like that's being Greek Orthodox, my entire life, it was always like, family doesn't argue over money. You just always forgive. And so there would be and we've never had to argue over money, but I can just imagine that if we ever came into conflict, it'd be like, but your family. And so it almost dismisses all the misbehavior that anyone does within that dynamic.
Absolutely.
Because of the blood relation.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's not healthy for us to give a pass in this. How do you really make that distinction? I shouldn't be with a partner who is verbally abusive, but my father is verbally abusive. Most of us will find abuse in another situation because we're condoning it. A part of our brain condones abuse because we're in that situation. So it's not that we're like, you know what, I won't tolerate it in other relationships. To some extent we do. We start to normalize the dysfunction in other relationships. Oh, they just did it this one time. Oh, I'm just arguing with them about money. It's like, this isn't okay, actually, in any situation. These are not ways that people should speak to one another.
Amen. So going back to ghosting though, were you just saying, usually if you backtrack, you can kind of see where the ghosting comes from. Maybe you're ignoring the issue. It's not actually ghosting. They've explained it to you. It's more distancing. But what if it's actually ghosting and they use that as a manipulation tool?
I've had that happen before in a family relationship. I had someone stop talking to me for about a year because they did something really terrible. And then the next time we talked, they tried to get me to, I guess, minimize it. Yeah, so that wasn't that bad. And I was like, no, it's terrible. And I wouldn't agree with them. And they didn't talk to me for a very long time. And then when they talked to me, they continued to dismiss it. And I continued to tell the truth, but they didn't ghost me that time. But they won't talk about it anymore. That ghosting that happened as a result of, and it was on their end. They stopped talking to me because I refused to corroborate a lie. And it was a tactic to get me to change my position. to get me to say, okay, you're right. It wasn't that bad. Everything is okay now. And I'm like, I will not talk to you to the end of time, but I'm not going to lie. I will not participate in a lie because it's not fair to me. I don't want to be dishonest, so you'll want to be in relationship with me. So using the silent treatment or ghosting someone, yeah, that is a abusive tactic that some people will use to get you to let that boundary go, to get you to get over a situation, to maybe even never bring back up a difficult topic.
Oh,
I don't want you to talk about this anymore, so your punishment is me not talking to you. And I find it a relief. Sometimes it's like, whew, you didn't call me for a year. I was eating pizzas and it was sunny outside every day and it was wonderful. Now you're back. Gosh. All right, what's up?
but what about the times that maybe you don't realize what's happened and someone's just ghosting you and you have no idea what has happened, and then you start to like second guess yourself, you doubt everything you've ever done in their presence?
You know, when you're ghosted and you really, truly don't have a reason why, I think the work is really to deal with not having answers for everything. You know, it's like the whys of why did this person die and not this person? It's what happened here. Everything doesn't have a reason. Everything doesn't have some ending that we could connect with. We can't put the pieces together to every story. That is a part of life. That we may not know some things. And it can be really hard to sit in that like uncertainty of, what did I do? Will I do it again? But, you know, sometimes the ghosting is because of that person. Maybe they couldn't talk to you for a certain reason. I've been ghosted before. And I have no clue why the person ghosted me. Sometimes I'm like, you know, I remember being ghosted by a friend when I was getting married. And I'm like, was she unhappy? Or like, I don't even know why. Like I could make up a ton of things and I don't know. And it was really sad that it happened. And I just have to live with not knowing.
Did you reach out and ask them?
I tried to, well, this is how I knew I was ghosted. I was calling the person and they didn't answer. You know, I called them a few times. We had a regular, you know, sort of conversational style and they stopped answering. And I was like, all right, I guess that's done.
So you were okay with just saying, okay, I guess.
What else could I do? I don't know what else I can do. You can't force a person to give you a reason. You can't force a person to talk to you. You can certainly pressure them. You can pressure them. You can send them messages. You can call them 30 days in a row. But I get the point. You don't want to talk to me and I don't know why.
Did it create a wound that you had to heal?
No, because I don't feel like all relationships go that way. I have some very wonderful friendships. I have some very wonderful relationships with people. So everything doesn't go that way. I think that's a one-off situation. I think those sort of things happen in life. So it's not a wound as much as it's like, you know, when I have an inkling about people, I need to listen to that. When people say certain things about their other relationships, that I need to pay attention to that a little bit better. So it actually, in some ways, helped me pick healthier friends.
Is that because you're very self-assured? I'm trying to think of, like, you come across as very confident. And so I'm trying to think of women who don't necessarily have that confidence.
Yes.
That in that moment, they make it about them. Oh my God, what did I do wrong? Am I a bad friend? And then it's like, I want to fix it. I want to fix it. And now you actually do more detriment to your own self-esteem and who you are because you're thirsty, if you know what I mean.
I would say that the confidence I have now is practiced. I still, you know, I'm like, oh my gosh, look at my hair. Girl, your hair look good. You know, I'm still practicing. So there were moments where I was like, what did I do? And I'm like, girl, you didn't do anything. You know, so it's like, it's that part of me that's like, ooh. And then it's like, no, get yourself together, go. You know, so I understand that the lack of confidence is there when these sort of things happen to us, for sure. But I can live with not knowing. And it's much harder for me to live with blaming myself. So I don't want to be responsible for everything that happens to me. There are some things that happen to me where it's like, my fault. But everything, especially things I don't know, I don't want to take ownership of that. I have to attribute that to the other person because I don't have any more information.
Why do then most people self-blame first?
Yes, we do. Aren't we taught that in so many ways? You know, if you and your sister are in the room playing and your sister starts crying, the parent walks in there, what did you do to your sister?
It's so true.
What did you do to your sister?
It's all your fault. Yeah.
It's all your fault. You know, so we have to do a lot of unlearning that everything is our fault. Everything is our responsibility. When people do things, we cause this reaction. People are entitled to have a reaction to me. They're entitled to dislike me. Not everybody on the planet likes me, and I'm okay with that. I just need a few. Well, more than a few. But, you know, I just need some. I don't need everyone. And so there will be times where you go back into that, oh my gosh, it's my fault. But is it really? Or is that your conditioning? Not everything is your fault and some stuff is.
How do you, I love that you added that line at the end. It's amazing.
Some stuff is.
How do you then do it without biasness?
You know, I apologize a lot and I take a lot of ownership. I have 2 kids and, you know, kids are constantly like, you said you were going to, you're right. I did say that, didn't I? I messed up. You know, so there is this, I'm in relationships with people who will be honest with me and say, you know, well, when you do this, then blank. I'm like, I didn't mean to say it that way. That wasn't right. If I could do it again, I would say it this way. So there is this mixture of, you know, this is not my fault, this is. I need to take ownership here. I don't need to take ownership here. I'm human. I'm a whole person. So there are times where I still mess up how to say things. Here I am helping people with all these scripts and I'm like, ooh, I messed that one up. But, you know, I have the ability to go back and say, you know, the other day I said this to you and after I thought about it, it's probably better to say it this way. This is what I really meant. And so it has taken lots and lots of practice. Practice today, it will take practice tomorrow. I am not a complete human being in my thinking. I am still growing. And I think sometimes we get really bad on ourselves where we feel like we just need to be here. And it's like, I'm living right here. I'm just floating in between like, girl, bad job. Oh, you better. You know, so there is not this space of like, I've mastered it. It's like, I'm practicing.
I love that. And I think it's so beautiful, especially with everything we're talking about now, because there's so many nuances to these like individual relationships. And in moments where you try something and you're like, all right, I read Nedra's book, I've watched the interview, I got this. And then you try and maybe you quote unquote fail at something or you try something, you don't get the response that you had hoped for. In those moments, a lot of people can make it about them. Oh my God, I'm terrible. I'm useless at setting boundaries. We'll just forget it. Versus going, it's an iteration and you're never going to be perfect. And sometimes you set a boundary and maybe you let someone step a toe over the boundary, you know, but it's all about kind of redefining and then improvement.
I have a really hard time listening to people be hard on themselves. Oh, it's like nails on a chalkboard. When people are like, oh my gosh, I'm so... oh, my hair, or oh, I'm so stupid, or I'm like, oh, yeah. What are you saying about yourself? If you think you're stupid, you project a lot of that onto other people and you get upset at them for talking down to you because you think you're stupid. You don't even know you're doing that because you're not even aware of what you're saying out of your mouth. If you're saying that, oh my gosh, what you're thinking. Oh my gosh, your headspace is just like stupid, dumb, can't get anything right because now you're saying it. I am here to tell you it's not true. You came over here, you have on clothes, you have on shoes. You don't seem too stupid to me. You know, when people say, I have no boundaries, not true. Did you close your car door? Boundary. You close car doors.
I love that. So what
did you stop at the light? Boundary. You know, you're not without boundaries. Don't say that. Now, there may be some areas you need better boundaries. Who doesn't?
Why do you think we then revert to such a dramatic, big statement about ourselves?
It's that conditioning. We're going back to what was told to us. We're going back to being the bad girl, the bad boy. We're going back to causing everything that we're experiencing. Maya Angelou talks about, or talked about when she was a kid, she stopped talking for a few years because she was molested by someone who lived down the street. And she said to someone, I hope he dies, or I hope something bad happens to him. And guess what happened? He died. And she thought, oh my gosh, I killed him with my words. And so she stopped talking.
Oh my God.
Yes, she stopped talking. And, you know, she later thought, that's impossible. I had a thought. But we think everything that we say or think is about us. I can cause this, or I can do this. I'm the reason my parents got a divorce. You're not that powerful. You're not that powerful to cause stuff. You think it. We think all sorts of things. Sometimes our thoughts aren't good. It doesn't mean that it's true. Just because I think, I always mess up on so-and-so. There are probably a ton of people who say, no, you don't. That's not true. But we really get into these thought cycles about who we are and what we can create based on, you know, what we think. And, you know, my friend, our imaginations get so wild. I love a therapy session where I have a client that's just imagining all of this dialogue with a person. And then when I say this, they gonna say that. And I let it go because I like to listen to it. And I say, you know, you're a screenwriter. You are a screenwriter, and I would read your novel. If you wrote a book, I'd read it because it's getting good. This is the part where you're now saying that none of this has happened. Isn't it amazing how for 30 minutes you've just talked about all this imagination? Now let's come back to the real world and get to this story. And we do that so much. We get so creative with plots and, you know, new characters. And it's like, what are you talking about? All they said was, you can't come over. Now you're talking about, like, you've went way over here. You've brought other people into the story. And it's like, you have one thing. Focus on the truth. Focus on what you know is real. Because all this other stuff, it's fictive. It's imagination. It's a great story. You know, maybe you can put it in a book, but it's not your real life.
What up, homie? I got something free and new to share with you right now. How often are you visited by that negative voice in your head telling you that you're not smart enough, that you're not good enough, experienced enough, not fill in the blank? One of the most powerful things you can learn to do in life is to turn that negative voice into your bestie. And I want to teach you how to do that and so much more in my 4 steps to becoming confident workshop. And guys, the most amazing thing is you can actually register for completely free for this workshop. So click the link on your screen and I'll see you on the inside. I love that. The screenplay thing is so powerful as well because it really helps us get almost out of the own head of the emotion of it. And so when someone says something, and often if a friend calls me up and they're like, I can't believe it. And I was like, what were the actual words that came out of their mouth though? Because if I say to you, hey Nedra, your hair looks beautiful today. And you know, you make, oh, thanks Lisa, you know, really. And then I say it to someone else and they're like, hang on a minute, you didn't think it looked nice yesterday. And so now their retelling of the story is maybe Lisa insulted my hair, where that actually wasn't what I did. I complimented their hair. So where's that difference between what you're hearing versus what's actually being said?
It is your perception. What's being said is what we perceive is being said often. It's not the actual words of a thing. I wish there were a way to record our conversations and kind of listen to them, because so often what we think is being said, well, this person said that, and it's like, they didn't say that. I have been just like in the circle of someone regurgitating a story that I witnessed, and I'm like, that did not happen that way. It's the wildest thing that people can come up with what they want to believe about a situation. It's so wild. And I don't even think they're like trying to be toxic or mean or anything like that. It's just like their perception is based off of their history, is based off of their trauma, their childhood, how they've, been in relationships with other people. it's not really based on the interaction that just happened.
Yeah, they bring like all their past into this one occasion.
Yes.
And especially when you're the third party, that is so fascinating when you're like, were you in the same room I was in? Because that didn't happen. Even from childhood though, where my husband and his sister was telling a story at Christmas time. And so his mum was there and my husband was there. And to her, it's a traumatizing story, like scar. And it's, on the big scale, it wasn't a big deal, but for her, it really was. So I want to respect that. So she's telling this story about how it was really hurtful when she was a kid. Tom was in the room. His mum said it to both of them at the same time, and he doesn't even remember it.
But it was traumatic. So those are interesting situations too, because it was traumatic to that person. A cousin was telling me a story, and this cousin is maybe 15 years older, and she was like, you don't remember this time that we were looking for you and we couldn't find you? I'm like, no. No, like, this is your trauma of me. I probably was hiding in my little mind, like, I don't have that as a life trauma. I have other things, but not that thing. So it's interesting that your memory of that event is like, oh my gosh, I'm like, I don't have any memory of that.
Yeah.
It wasn't the biggest thing in my week.
Do you think that in those moments, it's almost then you start to compare your trauma with someone else's, and then you start to convince yourself, oh, well, if it wasn't a big deal to her, am I making a big deal out of it?
No, I think what's yours is yours. That's why it's really hard with family relationships to tell someone that whatever this isn't a big deal. Like, Dad yelled at all of us. It wasn't a big deal. Well, the yelling at me in particular was a big deal. Now, it may not have been a big deal to you, but it's a really big deal to me. And I don't think we can decide what's impactful to someone. And we try to do that sometimes. Well, I had this teacher and he wasn't hard. So if you have the teacher, it's like, how dare he be hard for you? It's like, okay, why are we trying to say like intensity for other people?
Yeah.
I don't think we can measure that. And often we try to, that this will be like this. I think you hear it so often with so many things in life. When you go in this place, it will be like this. It's like, well, Lisa's experience will be different because it's Lisa. Your experience with this person will be different because you are coming with your history and who you are and your personality and all of these things with this person. So you being yelled at or you being, traumatized by a thing is going to be different.
I love that you said that. I'm not sure why I thought of this, but I find that women have this problem with motherhood, where there are some women that just immediately are drawn to it. From the day they were pregnant, they're like, this is the best thing ever. And I've also met women who on the side are like, this is really fucking hard. Or it's taken me 3 weeks to feel bonded to my newborn. I must be a terrible mother, because every mother I speak to has these amazing experiences. And I think even to what you're saying about the middle child, or depending on where you're born, and it's still your experience. And I think that it would be really beneficial for us to now just be honest about our experiences with these types of things, because sometimes we do compare ourselves to other people who have been there. And if someone hasn't struggled and you're struggling, you make that about you, that you're incompetent, that you're no good. But when we're talking about kind of the comparison thing, I feel like that's actually really strong to be able to say, it's my authentic experience, and that doesn't make me less of a mother or less nurturing, which I've heard a lot of women feel because they're comparing themselves to other women.
Yeah, that comparison and feeling like our story should be the story of everyone else involved. It's really hard for a person outside of a situation to put themselves in the situation. And so, no matter the age of the person, and I think, kids, unfortunately, there's such power over them because they really can't control anything. So if they're crying that's not a big deal, or do it this way, or, like all of the stuff we put on them, all the listening to that I had to do as a child. I'm like, people are often like, what did you want to be when you grow up? Grown. I wanted to be grown when I grew up.
I wanted to be the adult that could choose her own food. That was
right.
me.
I want to choose can I go 2 places in a row this week, you know, because my mom would be like, you went somewhere yesterday. It's like, okay, I want to go somewhere again. You know, like I want to choose. So I just want to be grown. Teacher, doctor, whatever, an adult.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I love the idea of feeling an adult. And I think that that's one thing that in everything that we're talking about is really acknowledging, hey, you're an adult now. So the things that have happened to you, and you say this so eloquently in your book, is that people still blame their parents. As an adult, it's like, well, my dad was like that. Well, my mum is like that. And at some point, I love that you're just like, but now you're adult and it's up to you to choose whether you still show up like that or not.
Yeah, there's a story in the book where I talk about 2 brothers and their father was an alcoholic. One brother is an alcoholic. The other brother does not drink. And someone asked, you know, why are you an alcoholic? He says, my father was an alcoholic. The other brother who doesn't drink, he says, you know, why aren't you an alcoholic? And he says, my father was an alcoholic. So there is this perception around what happens to us that's really important. And some people, you know, maybe through training, through, you know, practice, maybe, you know, some of it is innate. They say, this is my circumstance and I can choose to do something different. And then there are other people who's like, this is my circumstance and it needed to be better for me to be this other thing.
I always think about that with like abusers. The same thing. It's like some people grow up to then abuse their children and other people grow up to say, I'm never going to even spank my child or even slap them on the hand because I was physically abused, you know, as a child. And so it's interesting, those dynamics of how one person chooses one path versus the other. And now that we're talking about being an adult and being able to make these decisions, what about those situations where you almost cannot leave? And the example that you give in your book is like in-laws. You can't just ditch in-laws. So how do you navigate a relationship with your in-laws?
The biggest thing with in-laws is to remember that you are joining a family culture. You don't have to love and like these people. You need to be cordial and get along. A lot of our stuff, unfortunately, is put on the in-laws. My mother-in-law should be nice. Maybe not. Maybe she just cooks well. She might not be nice. You know, we have these ideas about how other people should show up. You know, their family is loud. Okay. You know, you invite them over and when they leave, you're like, whew, house quiet again. It's not that simple, but I think we do have to get into the practice of understanding that our job in this relationship is not to control it, is not to change a culture. It is to be in community with people. And you don't have to be best friends with your in-laws. It can just be, this is, you know, my partner's parents. These are, you know, the grandparents or the aunts of my children. It doesn't have to be, you know, I am just so in love with my mother-in-law. But I find that that's our expectation, that it's just like happy, this person is, you know, a certain way, and we can't control that about people. What we can control is how we decide to show up in those relationships, how we decide to communicate with them. We can't make them anything other than what they are. And that goes for our family too, that we can't change people and we certainly can't change our in-laws.
But what would you do if they're toxic people? Because at least within your family, I at least don't think of I have an obligation to my husband to keep talking to my mother, right? It's like, it's two separate. She's my mom. If she's toxic, then I'm going to make that decision. But when it's your partner's parent and they're toxic, how do you protect your own space and your own, you know, harmony?
Talk to your partner about it. You know, I think it's always best if your partner can deal with their family. It does become problematic when you and your partner don't see things the same way. And they're like, my family is great. Like, there's nothing wrong with my family. In that case, you can still put up your boundaries. You know, I've certainly heard of, you know, people saying, when my mother-in-law comes to visit, she can't stay with us. That's not, you know, the partner's boundary. It's like, she can't be in my home. That's my boundary. So I think you have to think of, you know, ways in which you can still have some sort of connection with your partner, even if they disagree, because they're from that culture. So you're trying to get them to recognize a lot of stuff like, oh, don't you see how your mom is codependent? It's like, they might like that. And here's the thing, some of these things that we see as problematic, like enmeshment, codependent, addiction, other people may not see it that way. And it might not be problematic for them. The enmeshment that you have a huge issue with might be the greatest joy in this family. Everyone is alike here. It's like, we love it. And here you are like, you all can't do anything without each other. And it's like, yeah, that's the way we like it.
So what if that impacts your relationship then? Because let's say your partner is enmeshed in their family and you're finding that actually is coming in between you and them.
We have to do things separately. There are some things, there may be some compromise of, okay, we can include your family here, but not here, because we have a relationship as well. We have a commitment to each other and our family. We have created a family in this relationship. And as a part of this relationship, there are some things that we will have to do separate from other people.
And you think that if you have that discussion before you start to interact all the time with their family, so that there's just an understanding between you?
Absolutely. And, I think a really good way to think about this is in the dating phase, really. If you're in a relationship with someone who just refuses, if they have a horrible family and they refuse to take any ownership and, their role to have some boundaries and that sort of thing, that's something to consider and talk through at that point, and maybe not continue in the relationship until it becomes this really big thing. Some of those things are not new. They're just like things we've been dealing with. And, you don't want to like dump a person because of their family, but it's certainly maybe a time to go to therapy. It could be a time to start reading more books about in-law type relationships and having, some structure in those relationships. It's not once you get married. It's not once you have, kids. It's before then that you should start having these conversations about how you handle your family and how I handle mine, how we sort of think about the way we were impacted by our families.
Yeah, when me and my husband got married, so we've been married for 20 years, when we first got married, I thought it was his responsibility to set the boundaries in our relationship with his parents, and then realized, well, that was just a lot of pressure on him, and it was me and him having almost the debate and the back and forth, and it really was, hang on a minute, he's almost the third party. And so I decided I was going to build my own relationship with my own mother-in-law and go straight to her, and anytime I had a problem or an issue, I would approach it with her directly, instead of having my husband in the middle. And that became beautiful for my husband and I's relationship, because I used to be like, well, are you going to tell your mum? Right? Like, it's like, you're looking at your partner to tell their parent.
I love that. I love that. And I think that's a wonderful way to do it. And it sounds like that worked for you in your relationship. And there are some other people who may say, I don't mind talking to my parents about the issue. I think when your partner talks to their parents about the issue, it needs to be an issue for them as well. Because sometimes you'll have a partner who goes back and says, well, Lisa said that, and that's not very helpful. It needs to be, this is the rule in our home, or this is what we need from you. It's not one person. It is, we are a united team. And as a team, this is what we think. Sometimes, when you're dealing with your partner may not be assertive. Your partner may not like confrontation. Your partner may have their own things they're working through with their family, and they're not going to be direct. So you're right. It's important that, I don't want to have to say this, but I will say it as a way to preserve our relationship. I will tell my, mother-in-law, when I'm cooking, please don't come in the kitchen and tell me how to cook dinner. Like, those are things that you can do. I think of it as, in the workplace, the protocol for an issue is typically speak to the person directly. It's not go directly to your boss. It's like, speak to the person and just say, hey, I don't like that. Or, here's another way to do it. And then escalate the issue. But how do you, in your relationship with in-laws, figure out if this is a situation that needs to be escalated? Is this a situation you deal with on your own? Or if this is a situation you need to accept?
Nedra girl, we've literally just touched the surface of all the amazing information that you have in your book. Where can people find you, your book is coming out, and all the good stuff you're up to?
Yes, so visit my website, nedratawwab.com.
If you want to improve on your relationship, then keep watching so that you can find out exactly what boundaries you need to set. Nicole Pera, welcome back to Women of Impact.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
Oh my God, homie, I freaking adore you. You've got your new book, How to Meet Yourself. And where I really want to start is so many of us react to certain things. We get triggered in situations, whether it's in relationships with our partners, whether it's in business or with our friends. And I don't know about you, but so many of us, the next day, we regret the things we've said. We regret the things we've done. We don't show up as our true selves. And you really talk so eloquently about triggers, about where triggers come from, about how we can identify them and how we can start working through them so that they no longer become triggers. And so that's where I really want to start. So if you don't mind breaking down the different types of triggers, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're saying a whole mouthful when you're acknowledging how few of us are connected and or living from our authentic space. And I think those moments of reactivity are really prime evidence for how shameful so many of us can feel when we're in those explosive situations. And ultimately, I will make a case, and my hope for the workbook is to really make a case for all of you on this journey that those moments really aren't who we are, whether it's the habits that we're living daily or those moments where we can't navigate our emotions. Oftentimes they are coming from our past experiences, coming from environments where very few of us were taught how to safely regulate our feelings. And what happens in our current adult moments is as if we go back in time, in this time warp, which is a little bit of the reason why it feels a bit immature and we feel so shameful when we're living those explosive reactions. So I think to understand where we're coming from when we're not behaving in alignment with what our heart wants, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we are all compassionate or have the ability to be compassionate, connected humans. So understanding, why we're exploding, I think gives us part of the elixir, if you will, the healing, though of course then it's how do I shift in those moments? So if I understand this isn't me, how do I create the space to reconnect with what I really want to do, say, or how I really want to be in those moments?
Yeah, oh my God, God. Like when you said the word shame, 100% that hit me, right? How many of us feel shameful after we've had this? And when you want to show up, and I like to use the word badass, right? Badass, yes. Confident, enter a relationship where you feel like you've got your own back, that you can actually be yourself, or in work. The thing that does hold us back a lot, I do think, is our reaction to things. Is we can't control other people, but the thing that we can hopefully control is ourselves. But when we don't know where it comes from, when we don't know why we're having these reactive moments, it can feel very overwhelming and we can feel lost in not knowing how to handle it. And I actually got a quote of yours that I loved. Childhood trauma doesn't come back as a feeling, it comes back as a reaction. When people look like they're overreacting to something, they're not.
Yes.
So take me back to then how we start to identify where this is coming from, what different types of triggers there are, and then how we can start to peel back the onion, understanding them, and then start to, I don't know, reverse probably isn't the right word, but maybe come to a place where we're no longer having those triggers dictate how we show up.
Yeah. What's, I think, really important to understand in that quote as well is also not to minimize. While our feelings do feel disproportionate, for lack of a bigger word, really big for whatever objectively might be happening, I think some of us might seek to minimize, or maybe we've been told we're so dramatic, our emotions are so over the top. And I think a really kind of point I want to hammer home before I kind of go into what to do, how to navigate these moments differently, is just to create some space to honor the feelings that we're having. Because while they might not be objectively mapping on to what's happening now, there is a similarity in circumstance, in context, in underlying feeling that we're having that's contributing to their bigness. And I say this because there's so many of us who have lived a lifetime of shaming ourselves for our emotions in particular, of having this idea that we need to suppress or squash them down and not allow them the space that they are. Because when we're talking about these emotional reactions, we actually are talking about things that are sensations that are stored in our body, that for many of us have been accumulating from a lifetime of similarly overwhelming experiences. And without support in our childhood, without someone to help us feel safe as we're having bigger and bigger emotions, to make sense of them and then to figure out how to bring myself back into regulation, or really simply calm, a responsive, grounded place where I can say, okay, I'm feeling this emotion. I might take the information that it's giving me and I can still make a choice about what I do next. When we don't have that modeling, when we don't have that lived experience with another caregiver who can join us on that journey of making sense of our emotions, we are going to rely on a much more reactive way, because that, for many of us, is the only way we can find safety, whether it's the exploders out there who scream and yell, right, when we're outwardly upset at something, or when we're inwardly, I should say, upset with something. It comes outward in our expression. And then, of course, we have the many of us who maybe we're not screaming and yelling, maybe we're avoiding, we're distracting ourselves, we're numbing the way that we feel, or we're avoiding uncomfortable conversations or experiences altogether, again, as our main way of keeping ourselves safe. And then, of course, we have the whole bunch of us, myself was very much part of this group, who, because stress was so consistently present and I was so under supported for so long, screaming and yelling only worked a bit, removing myself only worked a bit, and then the last step on that ultimate train is becoming completely disconnected, living, as I say, on a spaceship where I feel numb, I feel aloof, and I don't really feel connected to the space around me. So those are just simple examples of what is really based in an overwhelming response. The only way I can create safety is by becoming reactive in that way, and that's what we'll see our then self doing somewhere in time into adulthood, of course, feeling very shameful, because who wants to scream and yell at our loved ones? Who wants to avoid things that are uncomfortable? Who wants to live a life that is completely numb? But again, at one time, that was the only way that we were able to keep ourselves safe when we didn't have someone helping us navigate our emotions calmly, which then becomes the task in adulthood. How do I create that space to see my emotions for what they are and to still be able to choose what I do next and remain connected to those around me and myself when I'm choosing what I'm doing next?
Yeah. Oh my God, that was so amazing. To see our emotions for what they are. That was so powerful, because so many of us judge our emotions. I shouldn't be feeling this way. So especially when it comes to triggers, because the other person is almost looking at you like, what the fuck is going on, right? Because if you don't understand another person's wounds or triggers or childhood trauma, their reaction may seem like you've like, hang on a minute, you're crazy. It's like, oh my God, I can't handle this. And it seems like it's overreaction, but really does stem from something deep. And so being able to view it, how on earth do you start doing that? Because I think so much of us judge ourselves based on other people judging us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, judgment, I think for many of us, going back even to shame, as we talked a bit about earlier, I mean, so many of us are so internalized with this process of feeling shameful. And it does come from this imagined idea of what we think and maybe what we hear other people, are assessing us to be or not be in those moments. And, to speak to your point, I think the more understanding that we have of what's happening inside us, that oftentimes then allows us to gift that same understanding to partners who are having explosive responses, right, that we can't understand. A big shift happens when you see someone. They might be behaving unsavourably in some way. And of course, this isn't to condone abuse. We always need to have boundaries that are up. But I'm going to have a much different experience if I see you having what I might deem as an overreaction. If I view it, or if I'm only reacting to maybe you're screaming and you're yelling, or maybe you're ignoring me. If I am only seeing the surface, likely I'm going to be hurt. You might say something mean. You might not participate in a conversation that I'm feeling is important, so I might feel silenced in that moment. That's going to be really different than if I'm able to stand in the compassionate space of understanding, oh, I might not like that you're screaming and I might not like what you're saying. I might really want to have this conversation with you if you're avoiding me. However, if I see that this is coming from fear, if I can understand that you're feeling destabilized now, I might not know exactly why, I might not be feeling the same, but in my opinion, that really does then create more space for a new response, for something different than is reacting right, to the hurt feeling that on the surface is initially what comes up.
Oh my God, that's so powerful. So I think it all stems from the knowing yourself, right? Understanding yourself, understanding your own triggers. Once you start to learn, you can then project. And there's actually one thing that recently Tom and I have been saying. So what would have to be true for that person to react in that way? Because I think of script writing, I think, okay, if I was to write the script and this person right now is screaming at me because I said, I don't like your shirt. What would have to be true that I've hurt them so much by me saying I don't like their shirt? Okay, let me backtrack. Maybe they were teased as a kid for the way they looked and they built their confidence just enough to find the courage just to wear one shirt. And so now what I've done is trigger them. And so I tried to kind of backtrack and just use the phrase, what would have to be true for them to experience this moment as overwhelm, anxiety, when I'm not sure what has happened to actually warrant, quote unquote, that behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really beautiful way to look at it. And the more information, of course, when we're talking about our close friends, our loved ones, our partners, you know, some of us can fill in that story, though we don't have to. And oftentimes it is that explosive person who's arguing with the world around us. I mean, some of us, that becomes our character. It's outside of these moments of where I'm upset and you don't like my shirt. I mean, some of us are so defensive by nature. I could go as far as to call it nature. And again, make an argument as so far as that there was a reason, right? There's a reason that this person had to become so defensive, probably in childhood, where being defensive, wearing that armor, maybe even fighting or scrapping my way through instances of overwhelming feelings, whether it was abuse or neglect or whatever it was in our home. For some of us, that was our only way of, you know, creating some semblance of safety or grounding. And again, when we look on the surface, that really defensive person can be very difficult to relate to connect with. But when we shift that focus and understand that that served them, all of our habits, as far as I'm concerned, and a big reason why I'm always talking about how habitual we are, all of our habits are grounded in a best kept or a best attempt at creating safety, at adapting to an environment. The problem becomes when we continue to repeat those habits as our environments shift and change, as our relationships shift and change, as we grow and develop and mature and have access to other tools. Because the reality of it is, in those emotional moments, we're going to rely on those habitual reactions because at one time, not only do they keep us safe, they're predictable. I know what happens next. I know if I scream loud enough, that threat will go away. And that's safer than what if I don't scream loud enough. The unpredictability of what happens next in new choices will keep us locked in the patterns, especially when we're threatened, especially when we feel unsafe.
Oh my God. Okay, so in saying all that, girl, how do we start to identify these habits? Because I actually love what you're saying. And there was something in your book, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like, actions are not who we are.
Yes.
How then, I love that because it's non-judgmental, it's beautiful. But knowing that it comes from our childhood, knowing that look, this may not be who you are, but it is a habit that you have adopted from childhood. How do we start to identify that? In fact, let's go deeper onto the triggers and then how we start to identify the habits that are tied to the triggers, because I didn't even think about the fact that even triggers have different categories.
Yes. So I yesed pretty much any version of what you said, I said, because in my opinion, what the workbook is about is discovering, exploring our habit self, all of the habits and patterns that create the life around us, create our day, create our relationships, and of course, growing conscious of them so that we can begin to make choices that are more in alignment with what we want. So I probably said multiple versions because throughout the book, what we really are exploring is how to become conscious of those habits. I always will talk about the foundation of change being that practice of conscious awareness, learning how to see ourselves. What are the habits that create our day? Imagining that maybe some listeners are probably shaking their heads and wondering, oh, I don't have habits. What do you mean? I'm problematic because I need to have habits and I don't have them. In reality, we all have habits. We have habits in terms of the way we naturally care for our body. How is it that you sleep, you eat, you rest, you move, you breathe? All of that has become, more often than not for most of us in adulthood, very habitual. Peeling back a layer, of course, and we begin the journey in the workbook with that body, really taking a deep dive, exploring all of those different habits that we could have, many of which we learned in childhood, most of which might not be serving the unique body that we are born into, then we peel back that next layer into the mind and begin to explore all of the different habitual behaviors, again, through this conscious process of observation, seeing ourselves, actually waking up, say, tomorrow morning and paying attention. Don't allow that autopilot to drift you through your day, take you through those morning habits. Actually observe, what are the first few things that you do in the morning? What does your mealtime habits look like in terms of your emotions or your mental habits? Beginning to pay more attention to your thoughts. You'll discover quite soon that we're not telling ourselves new, unique tales throughout the day. We are talking to ourselves throughout the day. Most of us, though, are narrating our life in, you've guessed it, a very habitual way. We're filtering everything that's happening to us, telling ourselves the same story. So the way we can see our habit self and create a bit of space to start to make new choices is by paying attention, learning how to be that conscious observer and either seeing externally how we're participating in our life or internally and how that is coloring how we're externally participating in our life.
Oh my God. That's what I love about your book. Like, you really do hold people's hand all the way through. How do we start to identify what habit is, I'm going to use the word good or bad. You probably hate that. In fact, what better words are there? Because would you say a habit is good or bad?
I would say it is, objectively.
Okay,
I love habit that. Just is.
Okay.
And then we get to decide, of course, if the result of that habit, right, is in alignment with the direction that we want to see our life going in, and or if it isn't. And I'm only pausing on that because I think when we do get into judgment around good, bad, I mean, first we have to unbox how subjective, right? I could sit here and tell you what's good for me, and you could be like, oh, that's actually terrible. That's not good. It's bad for me. We are very black and white in our thinking, and I think, again, that could back us into a corner. So when we're talking about being conscious, it's about being objective. So just literally seeing habits for what they are. They're just a habitual pattern. That is all.
And then I so love that. I love your answers. So if we do that, how do we then start to see if it does align with our true selves? Because very often, I'm just going to speak for myself, very often I can convince myself something because I either want it so badly or don't want something so badly. So as humans, I think we're really not easy, but we adapt to ourselves of it feels comfortable right now, instead of calling ourselves out on what may not actually be in alignment.
Yes, and I mean, what a mouthful of wisdom in terms of we will always gravitate to what is comfortable now. And what is comfortable now, again, like I said earlier, is what is familiar now. So this is where it becomes really difficult for some of us to not only have a more objective vantage point, because as I like to say it, we are blinded to ourselves. I know me so well. I know all of the filters of my life. I've excluded things that don't fit in with how I imagine myself in my life to be. And it's really hard for me to pull myself and kind of hover above and see the parts, the aspects of me, right, that I'm missing. So learning, I think, how to see the more fuller picture and really being honest, I think, is another part of the journey in terms of whether or not the decisions I'm making now, which might feel good because they're comfortable, do they serve what I want, what I desire, the direction, right, that I want to go to? And ultimately that becomes our individual process. So it's getting clear on an objective about, okay, well, what are the habits that are happening, that I'm living? What choices am I making, or what reactions are participating in creating the life around me? And then really taking that moment of assessment. You know, does this feel good? Is this in a direction that's taking me closer to whatever it is that I imagine that I want for myself? And if we have the supportive friends, the loved ones, of course, of a trusted nature, not opening ourselves up to feedback from people that really don't know us, they can often offer us, and sometimes offer us in moments where we don't want to hear their feedback, that more objective vantage point. This is where we do start to hear from relationships, maybe habits that don't serve the relationship. We maybe do get feedback from partners in these explosive moments that, you know, we're hurting feelings, and then we can allow someone else's perspective to be part of our journey. But of course, this is for trusted people. This isn't opening ourselves up for feedback from a million people on the internet who don't know us. But it's learning, again, separation, Can I view my habits? Can I do so objectively? And can I get really honest about the role I'm playing and how close that brings me to my desired outcome?
How do you do that if you're still feeling the wound, like you're still really living in the trauma? Bringing back those types of things can be another trigger, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And any time, I mean, really even going back to these moments of being activated, being destabilized, being explosive, or being, avoidant, whatever it is. And again, the reason why the workbook begins with that journey in the body is because safety is so incredibly important. Creating, the ability to feel that discomfort, be connected to it, and return myself to peace, to calm, to balance is absolutely 100% part of that journey. So when I hear you say, what if the wound is active? What if I'm having all of the feels? I'm upset, I'm dysregulated. Then not only are we talking kind of logically, oh, well, yes, just find that moment of peace and calm. We're actually talking about those body-based tools, ways to connect with my body, to release that overwhelming energy, or to ground it and calm it if it's too much and too overwhelming. And for a big reason, understanding the role of the body was a big reason that I shifted my practice from what was very much more of a traditional cerebral, let's just theorize about this, because what I had seen time and time again is no amount of theory, want better in those moments of reactivity, can shift the way my body is reacting, because my body is playing an absolute role. If my body doesn't feel safe, it's only a matter of time before I'm trying again to regulate in those older habitual ways.
I love that so much, because I'm definitely the person, I try to think my way through everything. Right. I try to think my way through my own emotions. I'd be like, Lisa, you're feeling this, but come on, you shouldn't be feeling. But I use all the shouldn'ts, which I always try to catch myself in real time. But so often we do that, where I should say, at least in our space, where it's like, oh, you listen to the podcast, you read the books, right? And it's just like, I know what to do. Yeah. It's like, and it's like, I can think my way through without actually listening to the body. So now when people are listening to this right now, how do they start to do that? Because I think it's so beautiful to open up that connection between the mind, the body. And you've said, like, our body holds so much trauma. And so I didn't even ever really think about the body holding trauma. I always thought, oh, if my brain doesn't go there, then I'm fine.
Right. And very true to form, so many of us actually rely on thinking about our emotions as a form of escape. I lived my whole life from my shoulders up, whether it was always analyzing the racing thoughts that I have, endless self-analysis, and then over time becoming so overwhelmed by that, I completely checked out and my mind went blank, and it was as if there was no body from the shoulders down for me. And a lot of us can enter into thinking, overanalyzing, and misinterpret and think that what we're doing is, oh, I'm being conscious. And again, conscious is a state of observation. It's actually not a state of endless critical thinking, judging, self-analysis, trying to convince our way out of emotions at all. Again, understanding that, though, is a adaptation. Chances are that was a safer space, my mind, than spending time in that body. So when I talk about consciousness, it's learning not only how to be the observer. I break down very accordingly to the 3 sections of the book. We talk about body consciousness in that whole first section, and how can I begin to tune in to my body? Can I use my breath as a hook of my attention? Can I use my sensations? I mean, I'm sitting in a very nice, comfortable chair right now. Can I actually simply tune into how it feels to be in my, Nicole's, body in this chair? That might sound so simplistic for listeners, but for those of us who spend so much time in our minds, distracted, disconnected, actually turning attention to what it feels like, my thighs, my back, these lovely cushions, is a big shift of consciousness. And once I begin to consistently make that shift into my body, what then I will be met with likely is all of the sensations that I've accumulated over time. Because even if we've gotten very good at being distracted, at being disconnected, at not thinking that we're feeling anything because we're not paying attention to it, it doesn't mean that our body hasn't been accumulated it. And the reason, again, that we've probably shifted our focus for so long was because it's too uncomfortable in this body. So learning how to notice when I'm in my spaceship, in my balloon, endlessly thinking, distracting myself with thoughts, whatever it might be, and then learning in that moment to make that most empowering choice, which is, okay, let me safely focus on my body. Let me ground my attention. Let me feel my heels on the ground. Let me feel my back on the chair. Let me pay attention to how I'm breathing in this moment. And now I'm consciously present in my body. And of course, we want to practice that over and over and over again so that we can really begin to not only reconnect with our body, but over time, the safer we feel paying attention to it, the more then conscious we'll become of all of those underlying sensations.
Oh, I love that. That's so tactical, which is beautiful. As you were talking, I was like, how much of our senses have been conditioned? So like the hearing, right? When you hear someone shout, it triggers you because of childhood. Like as you were talking, so even with where you're doing your senses, you're touching the sofa, you're smelling the air, right? I know like becoming aware has a lot to do with what are you seeing, what are you smelling, what are you touching, what are you feeling? And as you were talking, I was like, oh, but what if we've been conditioned for that to be actually a negative thing? Like, how do we start to shine attention on the fact that we were conditioned to think of a smell in a certain way?
Yes, 100%. And the reality of it is our memory in general, and especially when we're talking about trauma memory, it's not language-based.
Right.
It is sensory-based.
Yes.
And I'm sure many listeners probably have even had that experience of walking by and, right, smelling that cologne or that waft of aroma from that person in your past who hurt you, and now you might as well be back in interaction with that person. My heart is racing. I feel nervous. Of course, I'm using a much more stressful past experience, but you're absolutely right, Lisa, in terms of we have these imprints that are often sensory-based, and then we carry that with us so much so that any similar smell, sound, taste, sensation of any sort actually brings us back in time, right? And then we live the visceral, likely dysregulation, reactivity, attempt to keep ourselves safe as if we are that younger year person, whatever it was. And so to speak to your point, understanding that we have, and this is, I think, why trauma in and of itself and any of our emotional memories really are difficult for a lot of us to put into words. Not only do they happen at a time when some of us are actually pre-verbal, like before we even have the capability to express language, but very much like I was describing, kind of the way our senses are stored in our brain, the way our emotional memories, or where, I should say, our emotional memories are stored in our brain. Of course, there's not one area. Many areas of our brain light up at one point for one functioning, but none of them are language-based. They're all sensory. So again, knowing in those moments, exploring for ourselves, what are sensations that might activate, trigger, whatever word you like to use, but bring up that deeper stuff, transporting us back in time. Of course, gifting us then not only compassion, I can understand maybe why walking past that perfume counter really caused that visceral reaction in me, but now I can open up the opportunity for some more of that somatic work, because now I know that my body, my emotional brain is activated, and I know I'm feeling unsafe as a result, and now I can make some choices to create some safety in my now moment.
Because I love that, because I was just thinking about, when you get with somebody, you've had a bad experience, especially in a relationship, these other sensories can start to rear their ugly heads, if you will, with a new partner. If like the cologne's such a beautiful one, actually, because I think, isn't it like the sensory in the nose, there's no filter, it goes straight to the brain. So that's the one that you can't even logistically like try and convince yourself otherwise.
Yeah, our sense of smell is really connected to the emotional memory sensation, and it really kind of, it bypasses a gate, a sensory gate too. So in terms of the imprint, I think most of us will feel that one strongly, but I'll make even a bigger global statement here. Even outside of our senses, the reality of it is most of us are cycling in past memories, in our way of being, in our relationships, similar experiences, whether or not it's, that smell that's activating this, really traumatic incident. A lot of us are operating in our relationships in general based on our past relationship, projecting, our parent figures in so many ways onto our current partners, and not necessarily seeing the objective reality of the differences in them.
Oh my God, is that trauma bond?
That is trauma.
So if you can take us actually from the trauma that happens as a kid, how that ends up being a trauma bond as adults, because it's such a awakening, I think, to the decisions we make, the choices we make, and then why we make them.
Yeah, so we'll start by a trauma bond. Very generally, or at least the definition that I like to offer for a trauma bond is our very habitual, patterned way of relating in our relationships or to other people. And with the idea being that much of it is conditioned, or again, that same dynamic pattern, the same way I had to show up for mom, dad, or whomever was my core caregiver in childhood, usually then becomes that same role that I adopt into my adulthood. And if we didn't have, a safe, grounded caregiver with their own sense of self or separation, different needs, able to then ground themselves through their emotions, allowing them to be present to us as a separate individual, being curious, helping us meet consistently the needs that we have in childhood, which we're dependent on them to meet for us. So that's a really, really tall order. I pretty much just described what I like to call a unicorn, because I've yet to find, a human who's really had that level of caregiving, because it's very difficult. So many of us are raised, in families that are transmitting intergenerational patterns or just simply ways of being. So much of it is influenced by ideas of parenting. I mean, there was up until recently a brand of parenting that would profess that children are literally to be seen, not heard. They don't have emotional needs, literally just keep them alive like a plant in the corner. And that's all that's necessary. I mean, this was a brand of parenting that,
in that era.
right? That, advisors, doctors would have said, yes, that's exactly how we treat children. And obviously now we know different. So I'm not minimizing or shaming parents by any stretch of the imagination. I'm actually, what I believe is offering the very human reasons why very few of us had that caregiving. So what happens is, because we're dependent, we need these people to literally keep us physically alive at minimum. If they don't even want to acknowledge emotional need, our body needs someone to keep us alive. We're so attuned and adaptive that we will keep that connection at whatever cost to ourselves, meaning we will always show up in service of that relationship with that parent to get whatever little bit of love they can give us, even if that means squashing certain aspects of ourselves. And because very few of us had parents who were emotionally mature or able to tend to themselves, their emotions, and create that separation, so many of us grew up as an extension of our parents, right? Of a need that indirectly us showing up by maybe suppressing our emotions, maybe being the kid with no problems, never causing an issue, or maybe being the caretaker for our parent. Habitually over time, we do that enough, we actually think that that's how we connect to other people. That's how we once kept ourselves safe. We define that as love, as a relationship, and before we know it, we continue on and seek that same pattern with our partners until, of course, we become conscious and we see, again, the role we're playing, how we're relating to others, what needs we're bringing to the table, what needs we're not bringing to the table, and of course, make some changes. But simply, trauma bonds come from our childhood experiences, our childhood circumstances, where our best solution for most of us was to adapt in some way, to meet a need, to play a role, to squash ourselves in some way to maintain that connection, because that's familiar, because that's how we need it to stay safe. We continue to repeat that even though at our core we feel disconnected, unfulfilled, and unsatisfied ultimately.
God, it's heartbreaking, but thank you for breaking that down so eloquently. And I believe you also talk about emotional need entanglement. Talk to me about that and how that really does show up in people's lives with everything that we're talking about the thing that you take from younger childhood, so that people right now can really start to understand themselves. And that's what I freaking love about your book, is you're really trying to help people just understand who you are, why you do the things you do, the habits, and then how we can work through them is so freaking beautiful. So yeah, if you can talk to me about that.
Yeah, emotional need entanglement. I mean, very much like the name says, it's when the emotional needs, often of two people, it could be a whole system, get merged together. Now, of course, when we're in relationship with someone, it's a space to honor needs, to go for support. But ultimately, there needs to be a point of separation, of distinction between I'm me, a separate, unique individual, and you, Lisa, are you, a separate, unique individual. And many of us who grew up in families who didn't have that separation, or who are enmeshed is another word, or codependent, we lacked that. What begins to happen is needs are met or entangled through another human, right? So by showing up, by keeping, say, mom or dad or whomever it was in your family, as happy as possible, as grounded as possible, as peaceful as possible, oftentimes by squashing our emotions in a certain moment, we become entangled. So my servicing you and your needs actually does have the byproduct of meeting my need, but it's through you in a sense. So we've entangled ourselves. We haven't created that distinction. And the reality of our emotions is that they are very individual experiences. While they feel like they come from the outside world, and of course they are activated in our relationships, we do need that separation.
How much of that happens in, because this may come as a shock of a question, but the reason why I'm asking is because my audience asks me a lot about narcissistic mothers. I get asked a lot now about narcissistic mothers and to really talk about that. So when you talk about this emotional needed entanglement, as you were like, I was just thinking about this, that young child that has a narcissistic mother that grows up always trying to serve that need of the mother. How on earth do you start to identify it, break it, and separate yourself from it? Because especially when it comes to like a mother, you hope that they're always in your lives. But when it's a narcissistic mother, there can become this tricky part of, in order to distance yourself, doesn't that then trigger the mother?
Yes. And so a simple way, what I really view narcissism as is a function or a byproduct of survival mode. And we all become I-focused when we are fighting for our proverbial or, survival. And a narcissistic parent of any kind, whether it's a mother or a father, feels so unsafe, insecure, likely again because of their environments that they grew up in, lacking a sense of self, literally becomes survival focused. So it's not often of an ill intent that I think a lot of narcissistic or people with that label, get kind of painted as. In my opinion, it's actually a survival mode that, again, I'm going to go maybe say something a bit controversial here, that we can all slip into and do when we're in that unsafe reactive state. And I'll speak from myself. When I'm screaming and yelling at someone that I absolutely love, you better believe I'm only focused on myself, at creating safety for myself. I've actually dehumanized. I don't even see my partner, whoever I'm yelling at, as a person in that moment. And that's just a little example of slipping in and out. And of course, I think that those of us that are deeming our parents as like the narcissistic parent likely are always self-focused, which does mean that the emotional climate, revolves around this human. The needs of the home, kind of everyone is servicing, making sure that other person's needs are getting met. And usually, again, it's at the consequence of ourself, of what we want. But I really do view narcissism as a self-focused, survival-based mechanism where that person is only trying to literally maintain their survival, often even at the expense of their children. And the byproduct of that, for being the child of that often, is we look outward and we might then continue to service, caretake, meet the needs of everyone around us, because at one time we had to do that to keep ourselves safe, to keep the explosions at a minimum, and then we keep repeating that, and oftentimes we're left with no idea, and this is again who I would imagine would be really helped by the workbook, who we are, what we need. We've lost ourselves in the service of someone else.
And that's what you suggest in going inwards, doing the internal work, so that you can actually start to identify what are the needs that you have and then start serving yourself, like you said. Because that was the thing that I was thinking through as you were talking. It's like so many, and I get it. Like I'm very honest with my parents, right? And I'm just like, I really want you to be proud of me. Like that's the thing. Like before you die, I want you to hear you say that you're proud of me, because that is the thing that I just strive for. It makes me feel good about myself. Now, my parents have said that many times, but when I think about if you have a parent that may have some narcissistic traits, I know that a lot of people would be like, we just pigeonhole everyone now as a narcissist. So I actually understand that not everyone's a narcissist. If you have traits, if you will, I'm just going to, again, presume that people are like me that want to have their parents proud of them or want them to be, happy. When you have a parent like what you just said, where it's like they're doing the best they can, sometimes they're just in like that scarcity, that fearful mode. How do you start to disconnect that? Like, because Like, do you have to actually give up the notion that your parents are ever going to be proud of you, that they're ever going to be satisfied, they're ever going to give you the pat on the back, and now you just have to do the internal work? Like, do you have to actually completely disconnect from that?
I think it's natural. I think most of us, we want pride from our loved ones. We want to know or have the idea that we matter at minimum, right, to these loved ones. So I think it's really natural to have, especially when it's our parents that we're talking about, to have that inner desire. So we can hold space, for that wanting that we have, and also maybe hold space for the reality, because now the very difficult, honest conversation around what power we have to change another applies, which is very limited, right? So we can wish our parents to offer us those validation or those moments of pride or even moments of connection or even just seeing us, because I think that's often what happens. We don't feel seen for who we are, especially when we have a narcissistic parent that actually can't shift out of their own focus to see, us for themselves ultimately. And so holding space for then the reality and knowing that we might not get that validation from someone, and then giving ourselves perhaps the opportunity to give it to ourselves. And a prime example, and while it's a bit different than validation, I love having the idea or having the feeling that I'm considered. All of this comes back to childhood, where I felt very limited moments of being considered unless I was performing, and having that moment of like having someone, see me, do something, acknowledge me is something that I deeply, deeply want. I now know my pattern enough and know that when that desire is really active for me, it's an invitation, of course, maybe to outwardly ask for my need directly to be met, for that active consideration of validation from a partner, a loved one, a parent, whoever it is. And in the occasion where that human can't or won't provide that for me for whatever multitude of reasons why someone might not be able to or choose to show up for me in that moment, I now have the opportunity to know that that's a marker that an invitation for me to provide that to myself. Because again, going back to the normal humanness of these needs, I think a lot of us are like, well, just squash it down. I shouldn't need validation. For me, I shouldn't need to be considered. In reality, I've learned that when I'm feeling that actively, I do actually need to be considered. It just might not come, or that person that I want it from might not be available, but I'm available. So I use that now as a moment or an opportunity for me to ask myself, well, okay, Nicole, if you're so desperate for consideration, is it possible that you're feeling like last on your priority list? Are you not maybe showing up for yourself? Yes, ideally, maybe you want your loved one, your parent, whoever it is, to offer you that validation, that consideration. And if they're not available, can I gift myself with that?
So I'm always thinking, how do you set yourself up for success? Because in those moments, sometimes you get emotional, right? Where it's like, it's hard to go from, oh, hey, baby, and then they dismiss you to you go, okay, well, I'm just going to go fit in myself. Like in that moment, you just feel freaking dismissed. And so how do you go to then, all right, right now I'm feeling dismissed, right? Like in real time, how do you process that? And do you have like a cheat sheet or something that you can go to? It's like, I feel dismissed, crap, what am I going to do? Go for a walk, got it.
I'm laughing because in reality, my moments of aha realization usually occur after I've thrown a temper tantrum, I've asked someone to come hug me, but held my arm up, my dagger's out, and don't let them near me. And so moments of clarity for me still aren't in real time, but giving ourselves the space, the awareness to dive deeper can be the beginning of the journey.
I love that you said that, because that is so important. I really need people to really freaking hear that, because here you are, you've done the work, right? You've written amazing books, you live your life in this space, and yet even you saying, look, it's still freaking hard, I have to do it after, is so aligning. I really hope people hear that. Guys, honestly, hear the words that came out of my mouth. Don't seek perfection. Hear that you can learn it. Hear that you can evolve. I am so sorry. I just had to say that. Thank you for being that honest.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the reality, especially when we're talking about these core reactive spaces. Those will be the last to change. It's a gift to give yourself that post-play where you're able to dive in, right? Because that's where it will begin. Ideally, we learn to be more conscious and to make those different choices in real time. Though, again, the reality of it is this is wired into our neurobiology quite literally. My body is already beginning to activate me, and I'm already interpreting, and all my systems and juices are off to the races before I even catch on to, oh my gosh. And again, that speaks to the point of the more consistently conscious we are, the more we can make different choices before we lose that control.
Right.
So for me, it even includes like day to day, right? When I go through periods like this, especially I'm promoting this workbook. So I'm traveling, I'm not sleeping as well. That means that my resources are generally lower. It's going to make it harder in those moments then to catch myself.
Ooh.
When I'm firing on all cylinders, I'm, taking care of my body, I'm getting the sleep I need, I'm getting the movement I need, I'm getting the nutrients I need, I'm breathing calmly and deeply all the time, then those are the moments where I might be more likely in real time to notice as my stress gets amplified, because that's usually what we're noticing first. Notice as my heart rate and I start to tense, as I'm starting to create, and send myself down that old path, and then make a new choice then. We attempt to notice when we're already so knee deep, locked and loaded and emotionally reactive that we're not setting ourselves up to succeed, or we're not doing anything to care for our body outside of those moments, and then expecting, some breath work to work or this conversation to come to top of mind the next time you're getting ready to scream, and you to remember to do what Dr. Nicole said. And that's just so unrealistic that we need to set ourselves up to succeed consistently, which means creating that consistent relationship where I can notice I'm depleted, I'm stressed out. So when I now go home and return to my partners, right, after a trip like this, I might not have that bandwidth. I might need to go and take care of myself and ground myself and get some rest, or I might find myself reactive in those moments.
Oh my God, this is so good. Like, the reason why this is so amazing, and what you're saying is, it's this predictability. It's know thyself, don't judge thyself, right? So it's like, oh, I know myself well enough to know that when I travel, I'm going to get less sleep. When I get less sleep, I'm more irritable. When I'm more irritable, something's going to trigger me quicker, right? And just now, when you're about to book a trip, that you're going to be like, oh, like being aware of, I'm going to be more susceptible now to being triggered. I'm going to be more susceptible now to feeling a certain way, to feeling dismissed. And so at least almost just warning yourself is a beautiful thing to do. And I love that so much. And I also liken this to knowing our cycles, knowing our hormones, right? Because exactly what you're saying, if we can lose our shit because we're hangry, right? Because we're just we're so hungry that we get angry. Now think about how we show up, if our hormones, if it's the beginning of our cycle versus the end of our cycle, if we've had the stacking effect of not eating, not sleeping, traveling, maybe having a bad experience, something's failed, and now imagine someone comes to you and even remotely skates around your triggers, you're going to be way more likely to have that eruption.
Right. And the reality, and again, why the workbook even begins with those body type habits is so few of us are caring for our body for many different reasons. We don't even think we need to, or that's part of this conversation around emotions. Before we even go into the part 2 around the whole emotional world, it's again understanding that we do have a body, and that is very much something that we need to care for. And I'm speaking from myself, who sleep was never a priority. I was eating inflammatory foods all of the time, for me. And so my whole resting state was a state of depletion. So everything I was doing, going about my day, I was living in that cycle of reactivity. I actually had no chance to be calm, to be grounded, to make new choices, to be in alignment, because none of my resources were ever met, unbeknownst to me, because half of this information, I didn't even know that it was important to take care of my body. I didn't realize the role that our gut plays. I didn't realize the role that our nervous system plays, which is, again, why with my first book, I was so passionate about getting that information out there so that we can know, and then we can start to not only make those choices to set ourselves up to succeed, but to give ourselves the grace in those moments, because some things are outside. When when we're going through moon cycles, when we're going through our cycles, right? I notice very much shifts and changes along with that too, in terms of my sleep and my overall stress-based resources, and that will then lead to more moments of reactivity.
Where do body beliefs lie in everything that we're talking about now, about getting yourself grounded?
Yeah, so what we think about our body is so much as well grounded in the experiences that we had. How were bodies modeled in our homes, right? Were bodies a comfortable part of day-to-day existence? Did we see caregivers who tended and cared for their body? Did we see maybe the quite opposite? Bodies weren't even talked about. I know for me, there was never nudity in my home. There was never conversation around body or changes like in the human development. None of that was discussed with me. It was as if we were all walking around afraid of a body becoming ill. That was very present, but we never actually talked about tending to a body. So how we care for our body is going to impact what we think of it. Also how we hear other people talking about our body, about their bodies. They might give us the best advice to care for our body, but maybe we have a caregiver who's so shaming of their own body, always on a diet, always self-critical, always trying to modify it in some way. They might be praising our body, but again, we're going to be impacted by the shame that we see reflected in how they're caring for their bodies. So what we think about our body is very much grounded often in the experiences that we had around bodies in general, our body in general, and then it goes to inform how we care for our body growing up. If I've learned, it's not surprising that, like I just shared with you, I didn't care for my body at all. I wasn't taught to. I was taught that a body only gets sick. I wasn't taught how to care for wellness in a body. So it's not surprising that I was entering my 30s and I had very limited care for my body. I had a lot of shame around my body. Again, not seeing a body being honored, being appreciated, seeing very much criticism around dieting. I saw my mom and my sister diet. I saw very negative comments. My mom made comments to me when she would see my weight fluctuating. So not only was I disconnected from my body, I didn't think very favorable about it at all. I'm actually quite shameful. And all of this came from how I saw bodies related, tended to, and how I experienced my own body in relationship with those around me.
Wow, how old were you when your mom did that?
My entire life. My mom, very much based in her own, conditioning. I'm sure what she saw from her mother was always commenting. Interestingly enough, it was very confusing because while she would so quickly, assess when I've, gained weight or whatever it might be and comment on that, she would just as quickly then too comment on not taking seconds at dinner, because she very much learned one of the main ways my mom connected, in absence of connecting emotionally with us, her children, was by providing, always having the dinner on the table, providing food, baking my favorite cupcakes. So very confusing, and I think this really illustrates some of the messaging we get, right?
Yeah.
Watch your body, but eat to love me at the same time. And then all of this got mixed up, confused in terms of I still see moments not only where I'm shameful of my body, but where I reward my body, myself, my achievements with food, very much like my mom, or I tried to connect with other people around. Of course, culturally, I think that's a different conversation in terms of connecting, but in my family, it was the only point of connection.
Wow, and how did that impact your self-esteem?
Oh my gosh, I mean, our bodies, even if we're minimizing and distracting ourselves from the fact that we have them, I mean, they're part of ourselves, right? They're our reflection outward. We adorn them with clothes, right? So how we feel in our skin very much does translate to how we feel about our self, at least our physical self in general. Sometimes it washes over our entire self. So while I very much felt good when I was performing and achieving, at my core, there's a lot of shame, a lot of feelings of unworthiness, and a lot of it did factor in terms of how I felt about the vessel that I'm living in with. I mean, I avoided something I'll share really quickly because it has to do with the body. Growing up, I was in all different types of activities, athletics, artistic pursuits, dance here, there, everywhere. And I have a specific memory because all I wanted to do was dance as a kid. I was really interested in dancing. I wanted to be a jazz dancer in particular.
Oh my God, did you really?
Yes.
I had no idea.
So to take jazz dancer, I think probably it would have morphed into hip hop because now I'm like, I feel that.
Oh my
but
God.
at the neighborhood dance studio, it was jazz, tap, and ballet offered. Long story short, to get into jazz, you had to take 2 years of ballet, which was not of interest to me. And I was a little girl in the back of the ballet class playing softball at the same time, very much achieving at softball. And I have a memory, you have to wear, or we wore little leotards, and I had a bit of a belly. I now understand that as being a lot of times when we have a lot of cortisol from stress, it can show up in particularly belly weight. But of course, when I was looking at all the other little girls around me, they were all very tiny in their little leotards. And here I was with this belly. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I probably wasn't the best at dance. I was always kind of tucked into the back. And before long, I started to really dislike going to dance, so much so that I would complain, and I ended up quitting dance. I stopped going to dance, I think 2 years in, even though I think in terms of interest and, I think it really was something I probably would have pursued. But I think the self-consciousness of seeing and being in a body that not only didn't compare favorably, I was so uncomfortable in my own skin because of all of the overwhelming stressful feelings that I didn't have support in tending to. I quit dance in favor of being in a softball body where I was able to achieve, I felt better, I got better validation. So interestingly, I think for me, it had a bit of an impact even of shifting me out of possibly pursuing hobbies, passions, things that were of interest to me. And of course, now I'm getting back in my body and dancing around. So that for me is huge.
That's so cool. I love that story so much. And the reason why I really love it is because everything we're talking about, it's like, instead of like, stop beating ourselves up over where we are right now. Like, we are an accumulation of things that have happened in our past. We can't change it. I wish we could, we can't. Until we figure out a DeLorean that we can go back in time, like, Marty McFly. And so instead of beating ourselves up over it, how can we take that as information for us to then be able to, hopefully today, getting your book, changing, really digging into who we are so that we can then show up to have the life we want. And you to sit here to say, look, this all stemmed from the fact that I think I was self-conscious in a leotard. I realized that why I made those decisions. But today, that doesn't sit well with me. And today, I've seen why. And I can change it. And I'm going to go do that dance class. Girl, I hope people freaking hear that. That is so amazing. And then as you were talking, also, I thought once upon a time, I would have been like, oh, it's our ego, right? Like, our ego doesn't want to be bruised. But what I freaking love in your book, and literally, it stopped me in my tracks. I was like, I'm going to put that on a Post-it note now, not to villainize our ego. And dude, I do that all the time. It's like, that bitch, like I call my ego my bitch. But I love that you actually said, don't villainize it. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about why we do villainize it, and then how we can actually turn it into a different message so that we can accept ourselves.
Yeah, so I think clarity a bit on ego, what it is, because I think traditionally, or a lot of us, when we hear ego, we think of that kind of narcissistic, right, self-focused, I'm better than thou, voice or way of being. And really an ego, really simply, as I often simplify things, is the story of us, like who we believe our identity to be, which again, as I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to hear, is grounded in how we've experienced ourselves and the meanings that we've made of our life and our experiences thus far. And again, grounded in our very real lived experience. We all are making meaning all of the time. If we drop in and pay attention to all the swirling thoughts in our mind, we're always trying to make sense of what's happening around us. And when we're younger, in that very early developmental state of dependency, something else that contributes, right, to this beginnings of our ego is the fact that we are developmentally immature, so much that we can't understand all of the nuances and multidimensionality and factors that contribute to anyone's decision. So when things happen in our home, to us, in our relationships, the only way that our developmentally immature mind can make sense of it is egoic or I-based. I must have been the reason that mom left, dad left, that this person's not available to meet my needs, that I was abused. I must be bad, unworthy, wrong. There must be something to do with me. It gives us a bit of control. And again, we don't have the ability to zoom out. We don't have the maturity to be in a relationship and know all of the different factors that contribute to why we do things. Sometimes we don't even know what we do. We can only assume it's us.
Dude, sorry to interrupt you. Holy smoke, that is like a massive aha moment.
Yeah, what's going on?
This is so powerful, my God. So okay, so if I understand it, you're saying, hey, look, as kids, we just need meaning. Otherwise, it's just utter discomfort. We need to be grounded. So as a kid, you can't put all these things into place. So it's actually a defense mechanism for us to say it's us. That ego, which comes from the Greek word me, I, right? So it's the ego, ego. It just gives me an answer to find some grounding so that I don't feel dysregulated. But it's in that we've now identified it's us that then leads into our adulthood that makes it think it's about us.
Yeah, it gives us control too, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
if
yeah.
I can just not be bad in that way, maybe dad will come back. Maybe mom will stay. Maybe I won't get yelled at, screamed at, abused. Right? It gives us that semblance too of understanding, meaning, and control. It gives us something to do about it, right? And then now I can adapt. Now I can change myself.
Right.
Now I can just show, right? For me, seeing a very stressed out household, there was only so much that the LePers could take. So I felt that. I felt the complete overwhelm all the time. So I started to share less and less about me out of concern that it would stress the system, because that was the experience that I had, right? So I squash part of me. I assume that I'm, the straw that broke the camel's back every time. So if I just limit, and then I became described in my family as shy Nicole, secretive Nicole. Nicole never tells us anything. Nothing ever bothers Nicole. All of that was so far from the truth. But if I feel like I'm causing or contributing at least to this overwhelm that's completely destabilizing me, I can just stop causing it. I can just bring less of me to that table. So back to ego, what then happens over time, because we love to be right, because we also then have a part of our brain that colludes with this whole process called the reticular activating system, that to deal with the seemingly endless amount of stimuli that we just can't physically take in as a human being, we are always filtering and determining what is of personal relevance. And what's of personal relevance are our deep-rooted beliefs, who we think we are. We love to be right and confirm those. So before we know it, outside of our awareness, we delete everything from our existence that challenges our identity. We continue to operate based on this story of who we think we are, right? So I'm nothing bothers Nicole. Not surprising to hear that I became perfect partner Nicole. Never brought an issue, never asked for support in my relationships. I led with that same egoic way of being, and I felt challenged, right? Anytime I tried to operate or share anything out of that. So simply, an ego is a story of us, very much grounded in our lived experiences, often adaptations, how we think we've had to make, or how we've had to make sense of our life without all of the developmental awareness that then gets repeated and filtered, that we get so locked and loaded and sure of who we are into adulthood that, let's bring this full circle, we can become really reactive and defensive if we hear something outside of what we know to be true.
Dude, that is the most powerful way I've ever heard ego expressed. That's amazing. It's all just fit into place. Like every block, as you were saying, I was like, oh my God, it's making a beautiful picture now. And it actually makes me think very differently about the ego, about why we focus on our ego, why it has a villainous thing to it. And actually, it's been our protector.
Right. Yes. It's been trying so hard to serve us, to keep us in that familiar, to keep us knowing ourselves in the way that we become comfortable. And anything outside of that, any perspective that doesn't match, this is again where we can get heated arguments with loved ones, even very well-meaning ones, who point out the shadow sides of us, the things that are harder for us to see, right? And or when we hear people who express beliefs outside of our own beliefs, we can become really reactive and squash, because the reason being, again, going back to this, what feels like disproportionate reactions in those moments actually aren't disproportionate, right? There are safety-making mechanisms. We feel challenged, threatened when we're having a new experience or hearing something new about ourselves. And if I've only come to identify with that very egoic story or who I think I am, now I'm going to be really challenged anytime I hear those alternate perspectives. And I'm not going to want to let this new information in, because then I've become unfamiliar to even myself.
Now you're challenging everything that I think of, and that challenge now becomes extremely uncomfortable.
Yes. Now I have no option but to take it personally, because what I feel is happening is a very personal attack. But we have to understand, so not to villainize it means observing it, seeing these stories, seeing how we're coloring our experiences with possibly this reactivity, and expanding the space to acknowledge all of the rest of us. Everything that maybe didn't have space or safety in our childhood to express, everything that maybe I've shut down about myself to at one point keep myself connected and safe, that's still part of us. So the goal of ego work in general is to acknowledge that I've yet to meet a human who doesn't have an ego, who's not doing some of this subconscious filtering and biasing and reacting when it's kind of outside of our familiar bounds of self, to acknowledge that maybe in those moments we are feeling a bit threatened, and then over time being able to expand and allowing in the rest of our being that probably has been just pushed below the surface.
I love that. And you also say like name your ego, Jessica.
That's right. I think it can be really, really helpful. And that's like a silly way to play with it, but to create that separation, right? The ego isn't me. It's a part of my story. It's been a very validated part of my story that, again, has kept me safely protected as the overachiever without needs because that's who I had to be. So thank you, Jessica, for your service. And I think sometimes acknowledging when that voice is active by calling it Jessica's voice can be the beginning of that separation. Jessica is part of my story, has played a protective role in my story, but Jessica isn't who Nicole is. There's much more to Nicole. So I invite anyone listening to not only observe their ego, anytime we think anytime we're having thoughts that are very much kind of about me, who I think I am, what my place is in the world, pay attention to how repetitive and habitual those stories are. That might be the voice of that ego. And if you would like to give your ego a name, again, I think that can help create that separation, maybe even add a bit of humor, which I think helps on all of our journeys. When the ego comes alive, you can acknowledge, oh, Jessica,
That's what I really like about it. And obviously, people have talked about like alter egos, but I've never really thought about it in this realm as a way to help yourself get over triggers, get over emotional issues, get over trauma. Like I've never really thought of, I've always thought of like, alter ego like Sasha Fierce.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's like, and it's like me with my hair. It's like, I don't always have my hair like this, but it's my way of showing up. But I've never thought of ego as being like that. Like when you have something that maybe stings or maybe it shows up, to just say, oh, it's Jessica. Like having that kind of like your mate where it's like, oh, it's her, but it doesn't mean that it's me. Because I think when we think of it as being, this is who I am, it can like really like create knots. I mean, explain to me actually what that's doing to us.
I think what you're describing is that constriction, is limitation. Right, it's kind of shrinking in. I mean, when we've defined who we are, we don't really give us any other option to have any other experience of ourselves. I think egos, identities, to some extent, largely can be limiting if we make that our whole story. And the reality is, and I think it's a tough reality for most of us living this human experience, is that we are multidimensional. There isn't just one way to kind of summarize or put in a bucket or put a hat on what I am even, right? There's so much of what I am. And I can even make a case that there's an evolution of what I am in and of myself. So when we embrace that multidimensionality, I think then we allow ourselves that space. But so few of us do that. We become constricted. We kind of even feel ourselves tense inside. And I could even go as far to say that some of us inhabit then the role of, and this is where we can talk about, and actually the next book that I'm working on relationships is going to talk a lot about what I call conditioned selves, when this idea of ego actually morphs into this whole embodied function role I play, where I become, right, the caretaker in a relationship, where my whole sense of self is based on this idea of that's all I am. I'm a person who provides care. My neurobiology shifts, and I embody that actual self. So I can make a statement that ego, right, becomes the cloud that some of us can become the weather of. And we limit ourselves that we can't even imagine stepping outside of our roles, let alone our stories.
Wow, God, that's so strong. You mentioned, and I didn't want to interrupt you, our shadow selves. So how in everything that we're talking about, can we identify what our shadow selves are? If you actually don't mind explaining what that is, let's start there.
Yes, so our shadow is all of the repressed, which means kept out of our awareness, aspects of ourselves. So if in childhood, again, we didn't have the space to be sad, be angry, maybe just self-express our creativity or just be who we are, the more consistently we got a message, direct or indirect, not to do that, that those things don't go away, emotions don't go away, that aspect of ourself doesn't go away. It might go out of our conscious awareness, and then we call that it's repressed in our shadow, if you will. Think of like the shadow that's cast, we can't see it necessarily. Where we do experience our shadow often is sometimes when we have, this is very interesting, it's funny that I brought that dance story. I imagine this is why, I didn't know you were going to go to shadow, but what I would notice when good old Instagram came to be, the dancing app as it was began, can imagine where I'm going here, scrolling Instagram, seeing people dance freely, that constriction you just felt, I would almost seethe inside. I would feel my body clench, and I might even think some negative, critical things about the dancer. Not, oh wow, look at this beautiful dancer in full self-expression, how nice, what a thing that my little self would have wanted. So repressed, all of that, that what I saw in that freedom of self-expression, that ease in the body that at least communicates to me when I see someone dancing, all of that aspect of myself was so pushed outside of my awareness. The desire to be free and at ease in my body was projected, is what we call it, and came out as irritation, negative reaction at something I see in someone else. Understanding that the shadow of it, right, was in me. I didn't see it in myself. The ability to be easeful, free, connected to one's body, I saw it in that person and I had a negative reaction. So that's a lot of times where we can see our shadow reflected when we are turned off by certain aspects of another person is a really great place to wonder within. Seeing if there's an aspect of ourself, because I can make a case that we all have aspects of everyone inside of us.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's certain times where we're all a little bit of something in different moments. So when we have those big visceral reactions can be an indicator. And it isn't always negative things that we're repressing, right? Some of us might have learned to repress even our ability to shine, talents that we've had. If there wasn't space or if that wasn't rewarded, maybe in the traditional sense, our parents didn't think that that was going to get us the good paying job that they wanted. It could be some of our natural gifts and talents that we've squashed below the surface. Again, all because of the messaging that we got. Doesn't mean it's not in us. Oftentimes it's activated when we see it in someone else, and usually it's unfavorable how we're feeling, because when it really comes down to it, we don't like that part of ourselves.
Oh, and so do you think that we should start, I mean, yes, you have a workbook, so I'm sure your answer's going to be yes, but like starting to take inventory, because as you were talking, it's like, how do you actually start to identify your shadow self? Obviously, you said, you know, when you're starting to get that uncomfortable, maybe that negative, like that could be a sign. Is that where people should start? Like if someone's just starting right now and they're like, oh, I don't recognize that I'm showing up like that. I actually do believe I really hate this dance and I really hate that, you know, the shoes that that woman's wearing or whatever. But a lot of the time there's that deep rooted thing, right? So what would you suggest? Yeah, would it be inventory, then backtracking? What would that look like?
Yeah, paying attention. I think anytime, I'm going to answer this really globally, anytime we're having a feeling, we can get really curious and begin to explore what's causing it. So whether it's the negative reaction to the Instagram post that you're seeing, the negative reaction to the comment that your partner made, right? Feelings are meant to provide us information. If we can learn, right, how to, in a grounded way, see them, allow them in, I should say first, and allow them to not dysregulate us so that they can be part of our experience, but not color our experience and overwhelm us and send us back into that cycle of reactivity. But when we can, you know, negotiate life with emotions, then I think any time we have an emotion that's activated, especially a big one, can give us an opportunity to then explore and then getting really honest. Okay, well, what is it? What am I reacting to? What is it about those shoes? What is my mind telling myself about the person who wears those shoes maybe? Oh, well, that's a person who would X, Y, or Z. And oh, that's something that I don't want to be about. Oh, okay, well, can I see any moments where I am X, Y, or Z, or where I too act on X, Y, or Z, right? That's just a little bit of a quick way of doing that backtracking. But start with any feelings. Feelings are information. The more consistently we have feelings, the bigger the feelings are, we can explore. Again, what is the meaning I'm making? What is my mind telling me about the person who's wearing or doing this thing? And if I'm really honest, can I locate a place in time where I see that in me? And can I work to allow that to be okay?
That is so beautiful. And you said this earlier, but I want to repeat it because it fits so perfectly here as well, is that once you start to understand everything you're saying, once you start to practice it yourself, you can now actually see it in other people and I think have more understanding. So when someone is coming to you having this, you know, heightened reaction, if you've already done the work and you're like, oh, this may be their shadow self, what am I doing? Like I try to be as empathetic as I possibly can. And look, we're on social, so we probably open ourselves up a lot more than other people. But when you get pushback, hate, negative comments, whether it's on social or even within your own family, I try to then put on my empathetic hat. And now you're giving me words to be able to use, because I normally say, oh, I've probably triggered them. How did I trigger them? Like, I kind of just go to that because I'm like, well, because I wore my hair like this, all of a sudden they're freaking out. Like, what the hell did I do? And so I go, okay, it's a trigger. But now being able to use the shadow self is actually really beautiful language to be able to say, like, what is in their shadow self and maybe they've squished that I'm triggering that to now rear its head.
Yeah, what you're describing really beautifully, Lisa, is what I call depersonalizing, right? Learning to pull back and have that inquiry and see, the moments where it could be about us. And this is where I say, having that nuance, that discretion, maybe not believing strangers on the internet who never met you, but maybe do listening to those close loved ones that have your best interest and might offer you that vantage point that we were talking about earlier. And in the moments, again, where it is a heightened reaction, it is a reaction or someone's making an assessment about you that they couldn't possibly know to be true because they don't know you, then you could kind of pull back and understand things and explore things from that vantage point, from a less personal. Yeah, they're saying and reacting to my words, my appearance, my way of being, or whatever it is, but for them, it's coming from a deeper place. I don't even have to invalidate, nor would I want to. Their feeling is very real. They're having a very real emotional reaction, though it might not be to me in particular, right? Just like I project similar, like we've been talking about this whole conversation, right? There might be a similarity or a meaning that they've made over what they think they see or how they're perceiving or subjectively hearing what I'm saying or subjectively seeing how I'm presenting that, again, is very similar to something that they've lived. Not invalidating what they're feelings and, of course, creating boundaries so I can safely allow them to have their feeling while I'm safely over here. But that's essentially the process of depersonalizing. I can understand it from a less personal perspective than I was able to in childhood.
Yeah, I love that. Dude, as you were talking, I was like, all right, let's just go masterclass on this interview right now. So everything you're saying, once we do the work, you even said, like, when there are people around you that you can really trust, that's obviously very important to feel safe around you, for someone to be able to maybe help you through things or point something out. What the hell do you do if there's someone that you very much trust, they've proven time and time again that they absolutely have your back, that they love you more than life itself, that they want good things for you, but their advice and feedback is all coming from their shadow self?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. In terms of understanding, of course, the more we know about someone, right, the more then we could have even like the statement, oh, I can see where this is ultimately coming from. I mean, we have choice, we can hear, we can listen. Ultimately, what we do on someone's feedback, on someone's perception, on someone's perspective is up to us. And I just want to emphasize this because most of us as humans, all of us as humans, we want to be heard. We want our perspective to be taken into consideration. We want to know we matter. We want to know that, if we are sharing our perspective, even if it's coming from our shadow self with a loved one, that it's not landing on deaf ears or being argued. So there's a way, I believe, to sensitively hear and listen, though ultimately it is our choice what we do with the information. So then having that moment where we can hear and graciously thank someone for their feedback, their perspective. We may not be able to convince them where it is coming from, even if we do have that vantage point of coming from the shadow, because ultimately we can offer it. It's up to them to choose it. So just as much as we can hear their feedback, we then go and I kind of have a visual feedback from anywhere that we can receive it from someone's shadow, well-meaning or not, and decide for ourselves. And I believe that needs to be part of the discretion, the developing of discretion journey of humans, is to have that moment in time, have that listen, not argue, not even try to convince someone that it's coming from our shadow, because if they're not willing to hear it, they're not going to be open to us being blue in the face, screaming and yelling or arguing it, so we can receive that information. Thank you for sharing your perspective. And then we could take that to our home base. We can then go observe ourselves and see if we see from their perspective what they mean. And ultimately, we get to choose, because it might not be for us. It might not be about us. It might never have been. And then we can have that choice. They feel heard. We feel empowered to continue on in the way that we know aligns with us.
Oh, I love that so much. And how much then, because you talk about heart consciousness, which I love. I'd never heard that before. So talk to me about heart consciousness and how this also plays in relationships when you have these moments where you have to go in and really listen to yourself and not necessarily take your partner or a friend's thoughts and advice as fact.
Yeah, so our heart is, we are now finding out very scientifically how incredibly powerful our heart is. I mean, there's so much about the human body from the shoulders down that is so incredibly powerful and so full of wisdom, from our gut, where we have those gut instincts, to our heart. We now know that our heart actually submits an electromagnetic field that's even more powerful than our brain. It's usually measured in how many feet away you can kind of feel the vibration or the frequency of our heart or our brain producing. And our heart, I think it's somewhere around 6 feet around us, can influence. So if there was electrodes, say, in a glass of water, my heartbeat would be able to, if it's within that 6 feet, I mean, don't quote me, I could be wrong on the exact numbers, but I think it's around 6 feet of our body, you would pick up my heart frequency more so than my brain frequency in that glass of water. So our heart is not only communicating signals to the external environment, it's communicating signals to our brain. Our heart actually plays a big role in coordinating activity. We used to give our brain all of the credit. Our brain was everything. And our brain is very, very powerful. But again, so is our gut and so is our heart. And just as much as our brain is sending information down, our heart is sending so much coordination of not only physiological but emotional messaging up to our brain. So as far as I'm concerned, our heart is the location of that intuition, that essence, right? That kind of indescribable sensation or compass or guidance system that we're all looking for. And because so few of us are paying actually attention to our heart, not only, again, is it our interface for our environment, giving us information about how we're experiencing it, in my opinion, like I said, it is really a vessel of what makes us us. I mean, I've read fascinating stories of, I don't know if you've gone down the rabbit hole of any heart transplant, or there's incredible stories of heart transplant stories where hearts of, individuals who have passed get obviously implanted into a living individual. And to the surprise, I think, of everyone involved, not only memories, taste, preferences begin to become evident with this idea that our heart actually has like memories that's stored in it. So our heart is incredibly fascinating. Again, very few of us, I think, for the point of this conversation, we're not connected to our heart. Or if we are, if we have those, again, instincts, sensations, because our heart doesn't speak in our thinking mind in the repetitive stories, it's sensations, it's kind of, I can't think of the word, little indications, aha, light bulbs, kind of things that seemingly plop into our, conscious awareness seemingly out of nowhere. All of that is more of the language, it's body-based, is the point I'm trying to make, of our intuition. And if we're paying attention to our mind, if we're not even attuned to our heart, or if we are and we feel like we know what our heart wants, but we override it based on what we think we should do, or what we were taught to do, or a million other reasons we convince ourselves out of doing those things. And I'm of the belief that the more, again, we drop into our body, the more we learn how to reintegrate or reconnect with our heart, and then attune to its messages, because again, it's much more on a sensory system. We have to learn to hear, even the way you describe, I feel that kind of constriction, right? That's coming from somewhere deeper within. So learning to pay attention to those signals will, in my opinion, give us that guidance that we're looking for, giving us the moments of saying, well, wait a minute, what does my heart say about this? What does my heart want to do? And the more, of course, we can align our actions with that heart space, the more then we're allowing our intuition to guide us.
That's amazing. But what about so, like when in relationships, so many people just like, oh, well, don't just follow your heart. Like, your heart's going to lead you astray because it's like it wants something. So maybe, the messaging that I've heard is your heart so wants to, let's say, be with somebody that it will be blind to certain things. People blame the heart for that. Do you agree with that?
I would question whether or not they're following their heart or their familiar relationship pattern in those moments, right? Because I think to really attune to our heart, it's again learning how to drop in. And I think a lot of times what we're attracted to in relationships, or what we think we're gravitating toward or is coming again from that instinctive place is more maybe coming from the familiarity of that dynamic than from the deeper heart space.
So when people would say, let's say, or the phrase, it's a broken heart, do you feel like that it is actually the heart that's broken, or that it's our perception of what this means about us, let's say stemming from a child where when we were dismissed or someone's left me, my heart breaks, but really it makes me feel like I'm no good, I'm not worthy.
Yes. And that produces a feeling in our heart too. So it's both and. Again, our heart is very much a conductor of our emotions. Our heart goes in and out of what's called coherence based on the emotion we're feeling. When we're feeling compassion, when we're feeling connection, when we're feeling love, it's described as we're in heart coherence. The rhythm of our heart actually changes when we're feeling anger, when we're feeling hurt, when we're feeling sadness. We actually did a podcast episode, Jen and I, on heartbreak and how very much it's in the body, and it does map onto pain and a shift in our heart's rhythm. So it's it's what happened in childhood, maybe it's similarity or lack thereof in what's happening now. It's still very real, producing very real feelings, which we can actually feel sometimes in our physical heart space, where it does feel like it's breaking. And it maps onto a physiological change in rhythm in terms of coherence versus incoherence.
That's fascinating.
It's really fascinating. I'm fascinated by the heart.
That's incredible. And, even in the book where you take people through, like put your hand on your heart, take these deep breaths. So as I was listening to it on Audible, but like as I was doing it, I was putting my hand on my heart. You were coaching me through it. And as I was doing it, I was like, I don't remember the last time I put my hand on my heart. Yeah. I don't know the last time that I thought about my heart.
Right.
And as you were talking, also the time that most recently sticks me is when my puppy passed away, my dog. He was 17, it was Tom and I's baby. And I remember when he died, all I could do was put my hand on my heart and go, my heart's broken. I was like, my heart hurts. And I just kept repeating to Tom, like, my heart hurts. I don't know why I'm getting all emotional. Wow. And I don't remember the last time I ever felt like my heart hurt. And it was like I was like putting my hand on my heart and just like trying to protect it. I've never done that before.
Yeah, I have memories in childhood. One of the most visceral memories I have is laying in bed at night, and it would usually come around a recurring nightmare that I would have, and I would wake up from this nightmare, and the pressure, it would feel like someone was putting their hand straight through my heart space, and I never had language and knew what it was. And obviously now looking back, I believe it was a broken heart of not having, for me, that connection with really anyone in my family, feeling so deeply alone, and that I remember very viscerally in childhood. I can almost call to mind what it was to feel that, and it was in my heart space. And then as I grew, interestingly, my posture even, for a very long time, my mom would be like, stand up straight. Don't you like being tall? And, I would roll my eyes at her as, oftentimes an adolescent, a teenager does, like, oh, mom, And again, I now view it through the lens of I was protecting this whole kind of hunched posture, at least the sense I've made of it, was coming from quite literally a broken heart of no fault of my mom or my family's own, of their inability of themselves to even be connected to themselves, let alone me, of a broken heart. And then my whole postural, protection that then translated to this distance in relationships, never acting like I had feelings, because I was never going to let my heart be broken again. And it was then, again, that visceral feeling in the heart that I can even recollect now of like, almost like takes my breath away feeling.
Oh my God, you're tapping into something so strong right now. I love learning new things. I love evolving. And so when it comes to our lives, how we show up, how we feel about ourselves, how we show up in other relationships, we've spoken so much, me and you have spoken about trauma in the past, in our other interviews, when we talk about the mind, we talk about the gut, talking about the mind-gut connection. But this new piece that you've just introduced to my life, girl, is really powerful. And so I'm just going to really sit with it. I don't even know why I got all emotional. And even this, I don't ever judge myself. I'm like, oh, why am I getting emotional? What is this new thing? Maybe you are tapping into this new thing of way of thinking, which now is unlocking more in my life and in other people's lives. And, I think of this thing as being information that now I can use to think through past issues, think through issues that I'm going through. So thank you so much for introducing this to my life as well as like, you know, in the book about
course.
heart consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll meet the heart in the third section, which I strategically put at the end, right? Once we are safe in our bodies to attune to the emotions, we can explore our ego, our shadow self, and then peel back all of those layers. And then, you know, we do meet kind of attuning to the heart in terms of our authentic self and learning how to drop in and allow that to speak. And I'm so passionate about it that the book that I'm also finishing writing that I was sharing about relationships actually is going to be grounded in heart coherence, in the science of, it's called How to Be the Love You Seek, to really embody, right, that return to that heart, that coherent space, learning how to attune and then be that love outwardly.
Click here right now to learn the 3 boundaries you must set in order to have a healthy, long-lasting relationship.
Other people don't need to understand or agree with your boundary in order to respect it. She may make you try to feel bad for setting the boundary and being the difficult